In 1877, Colorado, Caleb Turner held his newborn son against his chest as the child's breath grew weaker with each passing hour. 3 days without milk. 3 days of watching his only piece of his dead wife slip away. The town had already buried his wife. Now they were content to bury his son too. But on the coldest night of winter, when all hope seemed lost, a grieving stranger opened her door. What happened next would defy everything the town believed about family, love, and redemption. Stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The church bells of Grafton, Colorado struck midnight, their iron song cutting through wind that carried snow like thrown stones. Caleb Turner didn't hear them. He was past hearing much of anything except the terrible silence coming from the bundle pressed against his chest, a silence that terrified him more than any scream could. His son was dying. 3 days. That's how long it had been since Mary died bringing this child into the world. 3 days since Caleb had become both father and widower in the same blood-soaked hour. 3 days of watching his infant son grow weaker, his cries becoming whispers, his whispers becoming nothing at all. The baby wouldn't take cow's milk, wouldn't take sugar water, wouldn't take goat's milk that Caleb had ridden 6 miles to acquire. Everything came back up, and with each failed attempt, the child's strength drained away like water through cupped hands. Now the baby lay still and quiet in a way that made Caleb's heart hammer against his ribs with pure animal fear. He had tried everything. He had begged everyone. The town midwife, Mrs. Henderson, had turned him away that morning. "I'm 63 years old, Mr. Turner. My body stopped making milk before you were born. Try the Morrison woman on 5th Street. The Morrison woman had 8 children hanging from her skirts and another swelling her belly. She'd looked at Caleb with something between pity and contempt. "I barely have enough for my own, sir. I can't be wet nurse to every motherless child in the territory." He'd gone to the doctor's wife next, then to every woman of childbearing age he could think of. Some were polite in their refusals. Others weren't. By noon, word had spread through Grafton's 2 main streets and 3 saloons. Caleb Turner was going door to door begging for breast milk like some kind of desperate animal. The laughter started around supper time. Heard Turner's asking women to nurse his whelp, Caleb had overheard through the thin walls of the general store. What kind of man puts that on a woman? The kind who should have kept his wife alive if he wanted a living son. That voice belonged to Dutch Matthews, a cattle buyer who'd courted Mary before Caleb came to town. The man had never forgiven her for choosing a dirt-poor rancher over a man with money and prospects. Caleb had almost burst through that door, almost shattered Dutch Matthews' jaw with his fist. But the baby had stirred weakly against his chest, reminding him that he had no time for pride or vengeance. His son was dying. Nothing else mattered, so he'd swallowed his rage and kept walking, kept begging, kept searching for someone, anyone, who might show mercy to a child who'd done nothing wrong except be born. The afternoon brought sleet that turned the streets to rivers of frozen mud. Caleb trudged through it all, his boots soaked through, his coat offering little protection against the cold. The baby was wrapped in every blanket he owned, but Caleb could feel how the child's body temperature had dropped, how his small limbs hung limp instead of curling tight the way healthy infants did. By evening, even the polite refusals had dried up. Women saw him coming and turned away. Men blocked doorways with their bodies. One rancher's wife had actually spit at his feet. "My husband says you're disturbing decent folk. Says if you come back, he'll set the dogs on you." Caleb had wanted to shout that his wife had been decent folk, that Mary had sung in the church choir and baked bread for sick neighbors, and never said an unkind word about anyone. He wanted to tell them that this baby, this dying, innocent child, was decent folk too, more decent than any of them, because he hadn't yet learned to be cruel. But his throat was too tight for words, and the baby was too quiet, and the sun was setting on the 3rd day. That's when Caleb understood the truth. The town wasn't going to help. They were going to let his son die, then they'd cluck their tongues at the funeral and say what a shame it all was, and life would go on for everyone except Caleb Turner and his nameless boy. Because the baby still had no name. Mary had died before she could speak it, and Caleb couldn't bring himself to name a child he might have to bury. It felt like a curse, like saying the words would make death inevitable. The wind picked up as darkness fell. Caleb found himself on the steps of Grafton Methodist Church without quite remembering how he got there. His legs had simply carried him to the last place he could think to go. The church was locked. Sunday services were 2 days away, and Reverend Michaels lived 3 miles outside town on a homestead with his grown children. Caleb sank onto the top step, his back against the heavy wooden doors. The baby lay against his chest, barely moving, barely breathing. For the first time since Mary's death, Caleb allowed himself to cry. Not the angry tears he'd shed over her grave, but helpless, broken sobs that came from somewhere deeper than grief. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the child. "I'm so sorry. I tried. God knows I tried." The baby's eyes were closed. His mouth hung slightly open. His skin had taken on a waxy pallor that Caleb had seen before on corpses laid out for burial. 3 days without proper nourishment had reduced the child to something barely alive, a collection of bones and skin and fading breath. Caleb thought about Mary, how she'd glowed during those last months of pregnancy, her hands always resting on her swollen belly, her face radiant with joy. "He's kicking," she'd say, pulling Caleb's hand to feel. "He's strong. He's going to be just like his father." But Caleb wasn't strong. If he was strong, he would have saved Mary. If he was strong, he would have found milk for his son. If he was strong, he wouldn't be sitting here on frozen church steps, holding a dying baby and admitting defeat. "Mr. Turner?" The voice cut through his spiral of despair. Caleb looked up, squinting against the snow, and saw a figure approaching through the darkness. A woman, her shawl pulled tight against the cold, carrying a lantern that swung with each step. "Mr. Turner, is that you?" He recognized the voice now, Margaret Flynn, the postmaster's daughter. She was maybe 22, 23 years old, unmarried, lived with her father above the post office. Caleb had spoken to her maybe twice in the year he'd lived in Grafton. "Miss Flynn." His voice came out rough, broken by cold and crying. She climbed the steps and held the lantern higher, casting light across his face. Her expression shifted from curiosity to alarm. "Lord have mercy, you're half frozen. And the baby—" She moved closer, peering at the bundle in his arms. "Oh no. Oh, Mr. Turner. He's dying." The words came out flat, factual. Caleb was beyond pretense. "I've tried everything, asked everyone. Nobody will help." Margaret's jaw tightened. "I heard about that. Heard people laughing about it, too." She paused, seeming to struggle with something. I can't help you the way you need. I don't have what the baby requires, but there's someone who might." Hope flickered in Caleb's chest, a painful thing, sharp as broken glass. "Who?" "Elena Moore. She lives in the old Dawson house on the east edge of town. Lost her own baby a couple months back. Her husband left right after." Margaret shifted uncomfortably. "I deliver her mail sometimes. I've seen her, well, I've seen evidence that she might still be able to help, if you understand my meaning." Caleb understood. His face flushed despite the cold. Under normal circumstances, he would never approach a woman about such a private matter. But these weren't normal circumstances, and desperation had burned away his capacity for embarrassment. "Will she help?" he asked. "I don't know." Margaret's expression was troubled. "She doesn't leave the house much, doesn't talk to people. But she's not cruel like some folks in this town, and she knows what it's like to lose a child." She hesitated. "There's something else you should know. People in town, they don't speak kindly about her. There are rumors." "What kind of rumors?" "The unfair kind. The kind people tell about women who don't have husbands to protect their reputations." Margaret's voice turned sharp. "None of it's true as far as I can tell, but you should know what you're walking into." Caleb looked down at his son. The baby's chest was barely moving. Time was running out, if it hadn't run out already. "Where did you say the house was?" Margaret gave him directions. "East on Main Street, past the livery. Look for the only house with a blue door." "I can walk you there if you'd like." "No." Caleb struggled to his feet, his legs stiff from cold. "You've done enough. More than enough. Thank you." "I hope she helps you, Mr. Turner. I truly do." Margaret touched his arm briefly. "And I'm sorry about Mary. She was a good woman." Caleb could only nod. If he tried to speak about Mary, he'd break apart completely. He descended the church steps and turned east, following Margaret's directions. The wind had picked up, driving snow horizontally down the street. Caleb bent over the baby, trying to shield him from the worst of it. His own coat was thin, patched in several places, offering little protection. But discomfort was irrelevant. Pain was irrelevant. All that mattered was reaching the house with the blue door before it was too late. The streets of Grafton were nearly empty. Most sensible people had retreated indoors hours ago, gathering around stoves and fireplaces while the storm intensified. Yellow lamplight glowed in windows as Caleb passed, offering glimpses of families sitting down to supper, children playing on floors, couples talking over coffee. Normal life. The life he'd thought he would have with Mary. The baby stirred against his chest, a weak, fluttering movement that might have been breathing or might have been dying. Caleb quickened his pace, his boots slipping on ice, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Please, he thought, please let this woman help. Please let my son live. He wasn't sure who he was praying to. He'd never been a particularly religious man, though Mary had been. She'd believed in a loving deity who watched over his children. But if such a being existed, Caleb couldn't understand why Mary was dead and their baby was dying and the whole town had turned its back on their suffering. Still, he prayed. What else could he do? The livery stable loomed on his left, its doors shut tight against the cold. Caleb could hear horses moving in their stalls, their hooves shuffling on hay. Past the stable, the houses grew more scattered, separated by empty lots and frozen gardens. And there, through the driving snow, Caleb saw it. A small house set back from the road. Even in the darkness and storm, the door's blue paint was unmistakable. He stopped at the gate, suddenly aware of what he was about to do. He was going to knock on a strange woman's door in the middle of the night and ask her to nurse his infant son. He was going to intrude on her grief and privacy and ask for something desperately intimate. Under any other circumstances, it would be unthinkable, but the baby in his arms had gone completely still. Caleb pushed through the gate and stumbled up the path to the door. His hands were so cold he could barely form a fist to knock. When he finally managed it, the sound seemed to echo in the storm-muffled silence. No response. He knocked again, harder. "Please," he called out. "Please, I need help. My baby's dying." Still nothing. Caleb leaned his forehead against the door, fighting back panic. Maybe Margaret had been wrong. Maybe Elena Moore had left town. Maybe she was inside but refusing to answer. Maybe. The door opened so suddenly that Caleb nearly fell through it. A woman stood in the doorway, lamplight spilling around her silhouette. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe 30 at most, with dark hair pulled back and eyes that held a kind of exhausted wariness. "What do you want?" Her voice was flat, emotionless. "My baby." Caleb held out the bundle with shaking hands. "He's starving. Won't take cow's milk or anything else. I heard Margaret Flynn said that you could possibly." He couldn't finish. The words tangled in his throat. Elena Moore's expression didn't change. She looked at the baby, then at Caleb, then back at the baby. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, "Come inside. You're letting in the cold." She stepped back and Caleb entered a small, neat parlor. The house was warm, blessedly warm, heated by a stove that glowed in the corner. Simple furniture, clean floors, everything organized and tidy in a way that spoke of someone trying to maintain control over a life that had spiraled into chaos. Elena closed the door and turned to face him. In the better light, Caleb could see the shadows under her eyes, the tightness around her mouth. This was a woman who hadn't slept properly in weeks, a woman who'd survived something that should have broken her. "Let me see him," she said quietly. Caleb unwrapped the blankets with fumbling fingers. The baby lay exposed, his tiny chest barely rising, his skin that terrible waxy color. Elena drew in a sharp breath. "How long since he fed?" 3 days, since my wife died giving birth to him." Elena's eyes met his then, and Caleb saw something flicker in their depths. Recognition, understanding, the terrible knowledge of what it meant to lose everything. "Put him on the table," she said, gesturing to a small dining table. Gently. Caleb obeyed, laying his son down on the smooth wood surface. Elena moved closer, her hands hovering over the baby without quite touching him. She was trembling, Caleb realized. Her whole body shook with some internal struggle. "I lost my son 2 months ago," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. 11 weeks old. Went to sleep one night and didn't wake up. She paused. My husband couldn't bear to stay in this house afterward. Couldn't bear to look at me. Said I must have done something wrong. Must have smothered the baby in my sleep or missed some sign of sickness. "I'm sorry." The words were inadequate, but Caleb meant them. "My body still makes milk." Elena's hands clenched into fists. "Every day. A reminder of what I lost. I've tried everything to make it stop, but it won't." She looked at Caleb with eyes that held both pain and something like defiance. "People in town think I'm cursed or crazy. They cross the street to avoid me." "I don't think you're cursed," Caleb said. "You don't know me." "I know you opened your door." Elena's expression cracked slightly. She reached out and touched the baby's hand, just one finger against his tiny palm. The baby's fingers twitched, a reflexive movement that made Caleb's heart leap with hope. "If I do this," Elena said slowly, "the town will call me worse things than they already do. They'll say it's indecent, unnatural. They'll say I'm trying to replace my dead son with yours." "I don't care what they say. You should, because they'll say things about you too. They'll question your intentions, your morals. They'll make your life hell." Caleb looked at his dying son. "My life is already hell. Let them talk." Elena was quiet for a long moment. Then she picked up the baby with careful, experienced hands. The kind of hands that had held an infant before, that knew how to support a fragile head, how to cradle a small body. "What's his name?" she asked. "He doesn't have one yet." Her eyebrows rose. 3 days old and no name? "I couldn't." Caleb's voice broke. "I couldn't name him if he was going to die." Elena's expression softened slightly. She looked down at the baby in her arms, this nameless child hovering between life and death. "Then we'd better make sure he lives." She moved to a rocking chair by the stove and sat down. Her hands were steady now, no longer trembling. She adjusted the baby's position, and Caleb realized what was about to happen. He turned away, giving her privacy. "You can stay," Elena said quietly. "He's your son. You have the right to watch." But Caleb couldn't. It felt too intimate, too sacred. So he stood with his back turned, listening to the rustle of fabric, the creak of the rocking chair, and then silence. Terrible, stretching silence. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs. Had he been too late? Had the baby already slipped away? He started to turn, unable to bear not knowing. And then he heard it. A small sound, wet and rhythmic. The sound of a baby nursing. His son was drinking. His son was feeding. His son was alive. Caleb's legs gave out. He sank to the floor right there, his back against the wall, his face in his hands. The tears came again, but different this time. Not the helpless sobs of the church steps, but something deeper and more overwhelming. Relief, gratitude. Joy so intense it hurt. Behind him, Elena spoke softly. "That's it. That's good. You're doing so well." Caleb didn't know if she was talking to the baby or to herself. Time passed. The storm outside intensified, wind howling around the eaves, snow piling against the windows. Inside, the stove's warmth filled the room, and the only sound was the gentle creak of the rocking chair and the quiet, steady rhythm of an infant feeding. Eventually, Elena spoke. "He's asleep." Caleb turned. Elena was still in the rocking chair, holding his son against her chest. The baby's face was relaxed, peaceful in a way Caleb hadn't seen since birth. His color had already improved, no longer that terrible waxy pallor, but something closer to the pink flush of health. "He took quite a lot," Elena continued. "He was desperately hungry, but he kept it down. That's the important thing." Caleb approached slowly, hardly daring to believe what he was seeing. His son. Alive. Sleeping. Saved. "I don't know how to thank you," he managed. "You don't need to thank me." Elena looked down at the baby with an expression Caleb couldn't quite read. He needed help. I could provide it, that's all. But it wasn't all, and they both knew it. What had happened in this room went beyond simple charity. It was something more profound, more complicated. Two people devastated by loss, connected by a child who refused to die. "He'll need to feed again," Elena said. "Probably in a few hours. Newborns eat frequently." Caleb's relief turned to uncertainty. "I can't ask you to." "You're not asking. I'm offering." Elena's voice was firm. "This baby needs consistent nourishment, not sporadic feedings whenever you can find someone to help. For the next few weeks at least, he needs to eat every few hours, day and night." "I'll pay you," Caleb said quickly. "I don't have much, but I have a small ranch outside town. Cattle, chickens. I can bring you eggs, milk, meat. I don't want payment." "Then what do you want?" Elena looked at him directly. "I want to keep this baby alive. That's all I want." There was something in her voice, a fierce determination that Caleb recognized because he felt it too. The desperate need to save this one small life when they'd both failed to save the ones they loved most. "All right," Caleb said. "Then we'll keep him alive together." Elena nodded once, brisk and businesslike, as if they'd just concluded a practical arrangement rather than something that would change both their lives forever. She stood carefully, supporting the baby's head, and handed him back to Caleb. "You should rewrap him warmly. The storm's getting worse. You'll need to protect him on the walk back." "Back?" Caleb looked toward the window, where snow was now falling so thick he could barely see the fence line. "I can't take him back out in this." "Where are you staying?" "Old boarding house on 3rd Street. Mrs. Carmichael's place." Elena frowned. "That's half a mile at least, and the baby needs to stay warm, needs to feed again in a few hours." She hesitated, clearly struggling with propriety. "You could stay here, just for tonight. There's a spare room. It's small, but it has a bed and it's warm." Caleb knew he should refuse. A widower staying overnight in the home of an unmarried woman. The scandal would spread through Grafton like wildfire. But the baby was finally sleeping peacefully, his belly full, his body warm. The thought of taking him back out into the storm felt like tempting death all over again. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I'm sure." Elena's expression was resolute. "Let people talk. They're going to talk anyway." She showed him to a small room off the kitchen. It contained a narrow bed, a simple dresser, and a washstand, clean and spare like the rest of the house. Caleb laid his son on the bed and unwrapped him carefully, checking for any signs of distress. But the baby slept on, his breathing steady and strong. "There are extra blankets in the dresser," Elena said from the doorway, "and water in the pitcher if you need to wash. I'll wake you when he needs to feed again." "You don't have to do that. I can—" "Mr. Turner." Elena's voice was gentle but firm. "I've been waking every 3 hours for 2 months because my body thinks I still have a baby to feed. It's not a hardship, it's just what happens." Caleb heard the pain beneath her words, the cruel trick of biology that kept her body performing its maternal functions even after her child was gone. He wanted to say something comforting, something that would ease that pain, but what comfort could he offer? His own grief was too raw, too new. "Thank you," he said instead, "for everything." Elena nodded and withdrew, closing the door softly behind her. Caleb sat on the edge of the bed, watching his son sleep. The baby's tiny fists were curled near his face, his mouth making small sucking motions even in sleep. Dreaming of milk, perhaps. Dreaming of comfort and warmth and all the things he'd been denied for 3 terrible days. The wind rattled the windows and snow hissed against the glass. But inside this small room, warmth prevailed. Safety prevailed. Life prevailed. For the first time since Mary died, Caleb allowed himself to hope that his son might actually survive. That the morning would come and his child would still be breathing. That there might be a future beyond this endless night of desperation. He lay down next to the baby, not bothering to undress, his hand resting lightly on the small chest so he could feel each breath. Up and down, in and out, the rhythm of life itself. Somewhere in the house, he heard Elena moving around, water running, the creak of floorboards, the sounds of another person dealing with grief in the deep hours of night when sleep wouldn't come. 2 strangers, Caleb thought, 2 people shattered by loss, and one tiny baby who'd somehow brought them together on the worst night of winter. He didn't know what would happen tomorrow, Didn't know if Elena would continue to help or if the town's judgment would force them apart. Didn't know if he could bear to name his son or if doing so would still feel like inviting fate to steal him away. But tonight, just for tonight, his son was alive. And that was enough. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, a baby slept, his belly full, his small body finally at peace. And two broken hearts found themselves beating in the same rhythm, bound together by the fragile thread of hope. The night stretched on. Snow piled against the door. The stove's fire burned low and was stoked again. And in the small room off the kitchen, Caleb Turner held his nameless son and waited for morning. Whatever came next, they would face it together. All three of them. Dawn came late and gray, filtered through clouds that still hung low over Grafton. Caleb woke to the sound of his son crying, a strong, healthy cry that filled him with relief so profound it bordered on pain. The baby was alive, not just breathing, but demanding attention with the vigor of an infant who expected his needs to be met. Caleb picked him up, marveling at how different the child felt compared to last night. There was strength in those small limbs now, tension in the body instead of that terrible limpness. The baby's face had color, his eyes bright with hunger and indignation. A soft knock came at the door. "Mr. Turner, may I come in?" "Yes." Elena entered, already dressed for the day in a simple gray dress, her hair neatly pinned. She looked tired, exhausted really, but there was something different about her face, a softness that hadn't been there last night. "He's hungry," Caleb said unnecessarily. "I can hear that." Elena approached and held out her arms. "May I?" Caleb handed over the baby, watching as Elena settled into the room's single chair and began the process of feeding. He turned away again, offering privacy, but Elena's voice stopped him. "You don't have to keep doing that, turning away, I mean." Her tone was matter-of-fact. "This is how babies eat. It's natural. You're going to see it dozens of times in the coming weeks if we're going to keep him healthy." She was right, of course, but years of propriety were hard to shake, even in desperate circumstances. Caleb compromised by sitting on the edge of the bed, his gaze fixed on the window rather than on Elena. "Did you sleep?" he asked. "Some. Not much." She paused. "Did you know you talk in your sleep?" Caleb felt heat rise to his face. "I didn't. What did I say?" "Mary, you kept apologizing to someone named Mary." Elena's voice was gentle. "Your wife?" "Yes." The word came out rough. "I keep thinking if I'd done something different, gotten the doctor faster, been more insistent about—" He stopped, unable to continue. "She died in childbirth?" "The baby was breech. Took 12 hours. The doctor said there was nothing anyone could have done differently, but I can't help thinking that you failed her." Elena finished the thought. "I know. I think the same thing about my son, that I must have missed something, some sign that he was sick, some way I could have saved him." They sat in silence for a moment, two people who understood that particular flavor of guilt, the kind that comes from surviving when someone you love didn't. "My husband blamed me," Elena continued quietly. "Said I must have rolled onto the baby in my sleep. Never mind that I hardly slept at all those first weeks, that I checked on him constantly. He needed someone to blame, and I was there." "Where is he now, your husband?" "Denver, last I heard. Left 2 days after we buried our son. Took everything of value except this house. It was in my family, so he couldn't sell it. Sent divorce papers a month later." She said it without emotion, as if recounting facts about strangers. "The town thinks I drove him away with my grief, that I was too broken to be a proper wife. The town seems to think a lot of cruel things." "They do." The baby made a small sound and Elena adjusted his position. "You'll learn that quickly if you stay here. Grafton is not kind to people who don't fit their idea of normal." Caleb thought about the laughter yesterday, the closed doors, the woman who'd spit at his feet. "I'm already learning." "Then you should also know that if word spreads about you staying here last night, people will assume the worst, about both of us." "Let them assume." Caleb's voice came out harder than he intended. "I don't care what they think. My son was dying. You saved him. Nothing else matters." Elena looked at him then, really looked at him, and something passed between them, an understanding. a recognition that they'd both moved beyond caring about social niceties and into a territory where only survival mattered. "He's finished," she said, lifting the baby to her shoulder and patting his back gently. A small burp emerged, making them both smile slightly. "He's a good eater, strong. Like his mother." Caleb's throat tightened. "Mary was the strongest person I knew. She worked the ranch right up until the day before he was born. Never complained, never asked for help she didn't need." "She sounds remarkable." She was. Caleb stood, needing to move, to do something with the grief that threatened to overwhelm him. "I should get back to the boarding house, collect my things. I haven't been there since yesterday morning. Mrs. Carmichael is probably wondering where I am." "Mrs. Carmichael already knows where you are." Elena's voice was dry. "Betty Carmichael knows everything that happens in this town within 6 hours of it happening. She probably knew you were here before you finished knocking on my door last night." Caleb winced. "Then the whole town knows by now." "Most likely." Elena stood and handed the baby back to him. "Which is why you need to decide what you're going to do. This baby needs to eat every 3 to 4 hours. If you take him back to the boarding house, you'll be making this walk multiple times a day in whatever weather comes. And Mrs. Carmichael won't allow me to visit you there. Not unmarried as I am. It wouldn't be proper." "But me staying here would be?" "No. But at least the baby would be warm and fed. You have to decide which matters more, your reputation or your son's survival." It wasn't really a choice at all. Caleb looked down at his son, who was already starting to doze off, milk-drunk and content. 3 days ago, this child had been hovering at death's door. Now he was thriving, because of Elena. "I'll stay," Caleb said. "If you'll have us." Elena's expression was unreadable. "I have conditions." "Name them." "You contribute to the household. I'm not running a charity. You can chop wood, tend the chickens, help with repairs. I know you have a ranch outside town. You can work there during the day, but you stay here at night so the baby has consistent access to feeding." "Agreed." "Second condition, we keep this strictly practical. You need help with your son. I can provide it, but people are going to make assumptions, and I won't have my reputation damaged more than it already is by any actual impropriety." Caleb felt his face flush again. "I would never—" "I'm not saying you would. I'm saying we need to be clear about boundaries. Separate rooms, separate lives that just happen to overlap for the sake of a baby." "Of course." Caleb paused. "Is there a third condition?" Elena hesitated, and for the first time he saw vulnerability in her expression. "When this is over, when he's old enough to eat solid food and doesn't need me anymore, you take him and go. No arguments, no yanchi." "I can't." She stopped, gathering herself. "I can't let myself pretend he's mine. I can't do that to myself. So when the time comes, you have to be willing to leave." Caleb heard the pain beneath her words. She was already protecting herself against the inevitable attachment, already bracing for another loss. He wanted to tell her it wouldn't be like that she wouldn't have to lose another child, but he couldn't make promises about the future when the present was uncertain enough. "Agreed," he said quietly. Elena nodded, brisk and businesslike again. "Then it's settled. You should go collect your things from Mrs. Carmichael's. I'll watch the baby while you're gone." Caleb wrapped his son carefully in blankets and laid him in Elena's arms. Their hands touched briefly during the transfer, and he felt calluses on her palms. Working hands, capable hands, hands that had held her own baby and now held his. "I'll be back within the hour," he promised. "Take your time. We'll be fine." The morning air hit Caleb like a slap when he stepped outside. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. Everything was white and pristine, unmarked except for the path Caleb now broke as he walked toward town. The sun was trying to break through the clouds, sending shafts of pale light across the frozen landscape. It was beautiful in the way that only winter mornings could be, and Caleb felt a stab of grief that Mary would never see it, would never see their son grow, would never know that the baby had survived his first terrible days. The streets of Grafton were already busy despite the early hour. Shopkeepers swept snow from their storefronts. Women hurried toward the market, baskets over their arms. Men gathered outside the livery, smoking and talking. Normal life continuing as if Caleb's entire world hadn't been shattered and rebuilt in the span of a single night. He was halfway to the boarding house when Dutch Matthews stepped into his path. Well, well, Dutch's smile was unpleasant. Look who finally decided to show his face. Heard you spent the night at the Moore woman's house. Caleb kept walking. Get out of my way. That's mighty ungrateful, Turner. I'm just concerned about your well-being and your son's. Can't be healthy, exposing an infant to a woman like that. Caleb stopped. A woman like what? You know what they say about her. Dutch's voice carried, and Caleb realized they'd drawn an audience. Several men had stopped to watch. A woman across the street pretended to examine her shopping while clearly listening. Husband left her. Baby died under suspicious circumstances. Some folks think... Caleb's fist connected with Dutch's jaw before he'd consciously decided to throw the punch. Dutch went down hard, landing on his back in the snow. Blood bloomed from his split lip, bright red against white. Finish that sentence, Caleb said quietly. I dare you. Dutch scrambled backward, his hand going to his mouth. You're crazy. You assaulted me. You implied that woman killed her own baby. That's not just cruel. It's a lie. Caleb's voice shook with fury. Elena Moore lost her child the same way my wife and I almost lost ours, through no fault of her own, and she opened her door to a stranger in the middle of the night and saved my son's life when the rest of this town turned their backs. So yes, I stayed at her house, and I'll keep staying there as long as my boy needs her help. Anyone who has a problem with that can say it to my face. He looked around at the gathered crowd, meeting each person's eyes in turn. Some looked away, ashamed. Others stared back with judgment written plain on their faces. Caleb didn't care. Let them judge. Let them talk. His son was alive, and that was all that mattered. He stepped over Dutch and continued toward the boarding house, his knuckles throbbing. Behind him, he heard the murmur of conversation starting up again, Dutch's voice rising in indignation. Caleb ignored it all. Mrs. Carmichael was waiting in the front parlor when he arrived, her expression somewhere between concern and disapproval. She was a stout woman in her 50s, a widow herself, who'd run the boarding house for nearly 20 years. She had a reputation for strictness, but also for basic decency, which was why Caleb had chosen to stay there when he first arrived in Grafton with Mary. Mr. Turner, her voice was carefully neutral. I heard about your son. I'm glad he's improving. Thank you. Caleb headed for the stairs. I also heard where you spent the night. He stopped, turned back. I'm sure you did. I don't judge you for it, Mrs. Carmichael said, surprising him. A man does what he must to save his child, but you should know that several of my boarders have expressed concerns about having an unwed mother and infant in the house. I'm not an unwed mother, Caleb said, confused. No, but you're a widower with a newborn, and that makes people uncomfortable. Reminds them too much of death and loss. She sighed. What I'm saying, Mr. Turner, is that I can't keep your room for you if you're not staying here. I have a waiting list. So it had come to this already. Not even a full day and he was being pushed out. Caleb felt anger rise in his chest, but he tamped it down. Mrs. Carmichael wasn't being cruel. She was being practical. She had a business to run. I understand, he said. I'll collect my things now. I'm sorry. And she did sound sorry. For what it's worth, I think Mary would be proud of you, doing whatever it takes to keep her baby alive. The words hit harder than Caleb expected. He had to look away, blinking against sudden moisture in his eyes. Thank you for that. Thank you for... His room was on the second floor, small and spare. He'd only been staying here for a week since Mary had gotten too pregnant to make the trip from their ranch into town comfortably. They'd planned to stay until the baby was born, then return home as a family. Instead, Caleb was packing alone, preparing to move into a stranger's house because his wife was dead and his son needed milk to survive. He gathered his few possessions quickly. A spare set of clothes, his shaving kit, the leather satchel Mary had given him on their wedding day, a photograph of the two of them taken in Denver on their honeymoon, the only photograph he owned. He wrapped it carefully in a shirt before tucking it into the satchel. The last thing he packed was Mary's Bible. She'd been reading from it the night before she went into labor, marking passages she wanted to share with their child when he was older. Caleb opened it now, seeing her handwriting in the margins. Notes and prayers and little observations about life. One passage was marked more heavily than the others, underlined twice. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Mary had believed that, had lived it. And now Caleb had to do the same. Bear the grief, believe his son would survive, hope for a future beyond this pain, endure whatever came. He closed the Bible and packed it away. Mrs. Carmichael was still in the parlor when he came down. She handed him an envelope. "This arrived for you yesterday. I forgot to mention it with everything else going on." Caleb recognized the handwriting, his brother's from Montana. He tucked it into his coat pocket to read later. Right now, he needed to get back to Elena's house, back to his son. "Thank you for everything, Mrs. Carmichael. You were kind to Mary. I won't forget that. Take care of that baby, Mr. Turner, and yourself." The walk back to Elena's house seemed longer than the walk away from it. Caleb's satchel wasn't heavy, but the weight of what he was doing pressed down on him with each step. He was moving in with a woman he'd only met last night, a woman whose husband had abandoned her, whose baby had died, whose reputation was already in tatters. They would be living under the same roof, sharing space, sharing the care of his infant son. The town would talk. They'd assume things. They'd make both their lives harder than they already were. But what choice did he have? His son needed to eat. Elena could feed him. The math was that simple and that complicated. Elena was in the kitchen when he arrived, peeling potatoes at the table. The baby lay in a basket nearby, awake and alert, making the small gurgling sounds that newborns make. He looked so different from the dying child Caleb had carried through the storm. So alive. "You're back," Elena said without looking up from her work. "I am." Mrs. Carmichael gave up my room. Caleb set down his satchel. "So I'm officially homeless except for here in the ranch." "The ranch is how far?" 6 miles north. Small operation, 50 head of cattle, some chickens, a vegetable garden that Mary tended. There's a cabin, barn, well. Nothing fancy, but it's ours." He paused. "Mine, I mean." Elena's hand stilled on the potato. "You could bring the baby there. I could come out during the day to feed him." 6 miles each way, multiple times a day, in this weather? Caleb shook his head. "That's not practical. Besides, the cabin needs work. The roof was leaking before Mary died. I haven't had time to fix it, and there's no one else out there if something goes wrong." "So you're staying here?" "If you'll still have us." Elena resumed peeling, her movements quick and efficient. "I already told you my conditions. As long as you abide by them, you're welcome to stay." "I'll abide by them." Caleb moved closer to the basket, looking down at his son. The baby's eyes tracked movement now, following sounds, growing stronger by the hour. "I should give him a name. It feels wrong to keep calling him the baby." What would Mary have wanted? Caleb thought about that. They'd discussed names during the pregnancy, but never settled on anything definite. Mary had favored family names. Her grandfather's name was Thomas. Caleb's father was James. But Caleb found himself thinking of something else entirely. "Samuel," he said softly. "It means heard by heaven." Mary used to say that about our prayers, that they were heard, even when the answers weren't what we wanted. Elena looked up from her work. "Samuel Turner. It's a good name. Strong." Samuel James Turner. Caleb reached down and touched his son's tiny hand. "After my father." The baby, Samuel, wrapped his fingers around Caleb's thumb with surprising strength. Such a small gesture, but it felt like a promise, like a commitment to survival. "He's going to need more clothes," Elena observed, "and diapers. What you have won't be enough if you're staying here long term. I have some things at the ranch. I can ride out there tomorrow, bring back what we need. Make a list of everything. Don't forget blankets. It's going to stay cold for months yet." Elena returned to her potatoes. "There's paper and pencil in the desk by the window." They fell into an awkward rhythm then, working in parallel. Elena preparing food, Caleb making lists and trying to anticipate what a baby would need for the coming weeks. The silence between them wasn't comfortable exactly, but it wasn't hostile either. It was the silence of two people learning to occupy the same space, feeling out boundaries, figuring out how to coexist. Around midday, Samuel started to fuss. Elena wiped her hands and picked him up, settling into the rocking chair by the stove. Caleb tried not to watch, but found his gaze drawn anyway. There was something about the picture they made, woman and child, the ancient ritual of feeding, that stirred complicated emotions in his chest. Grief, because Mary should have been the one doing this. Gratitude, because Elena was keeping his son alive. And something else, something he couldn't quite name, a sense of rightness that felt wrong to acknowledge. "Tell me about your ranch," Elena said, breaking the silence. "What made you choose Colorado?" Caleb was grateful for the distraction. "Cheap land, open space. Mary and I came from Ohio originally. Her family ran a dry goods store. Mine worked in a mill. We wanted something different, wanted to build something of our own." "That must have been hard, starting from nothing." "It was. First winter nearly killed us. We lost half our cattle to the cold and didn't have money to replace them. Mary got sick, pneumonia. I thought I'd lose her." He paused, remembering those desperate weeks. But she pulled through. She always pulled through, until she didn't. "My husband and I came from Illinois," Elena offered. "He had this idea that he could strike it rich in the silver mines. Spent 2 years breaking his back underground before admitting it wasn't going to happen. We moved to Grafton so he could work for the railroad. He hated it, hated this town, hated being ordinary." "Is that why he left? After the baby died?" "Partly, but mostly he left because I reminded him of failure. Our son dying felt like one more thing he couldn't fix, couldn't control. Easier to blame me and start over somewhere else." Caleb heard the bitterness in her voice, carefully controlled but present nonetheless. "His loss?" he said. "Any man who'd abandon his wife after losing a child isn't worth mourning." Elena's eyes met his, surprised. "That's kind of you to say." "It's not kind. It's true." They looked at each other for a long moment, two people who understood loss in ways they'd never wanted to. Then Samuel made a small sound, and Elena looked away, returning her attention to the baby. The afternoon passed slowly. Caleb made himself useful, chopping wood for the stove, checking the roof for damage from last night's storm, fixing a loose board on the front steps. Physical work felt good after days of helpless worry. It gave him something to do with his hands, his energy, his need to feel productive. Elena watched him from the window at one point, her expression unreadable. When he came back inside, she had coffee waiting. "You don't have to work so hard," she said. "I told you to contribute, but I didn't mean you had to rebuild my entire house in one day." "Keeps me busy. Keeps me from thinking too much." Caleb wrapped his hands around the warm cup. "Besides, you're feeding my son. Chopping some wood is the least I can do." "I'm not feeding him for you. I'm feeding him for him." Elena's voice was firm. "Don't make this transactional. It's not." "Then what is it?" She was quiet for a moment. "Survival. For all three of us. You need help keeping your son alive. I need a reason to get up in the morning. Samuel needs milk. Those three things happen to intersect at the right moment." It was a clinical way to describe what was happening, but Caleb understood why she framed it that way. Distance. Protection. If she kept it practical and unemotional, maybe it wouldn't hurt so much when it ended. But even as she said it, her hand moved to rest gently on Samuel's back as he slept in her arms. The gesture was unconscious, tender. Whatever she told herself about keeping distance, her body had already claimed this child in some fundamental way. "What do we tell people?" Caleb asked. "When they ask about our arrangement?" "The truth. You're a widower who needs help with your infant son. I'm providing that help. Nothing more, nothing less. They won't believe it's innocent." "Then let them believe whatever they want." Elena's expression hardened. "I stopped caring what this town thinks the day they cross the street to avoid me at my own son's funeral. You should stop caring too." She was right. The town had already judged them both. Might as well give them something real to talk about instead of forcing themselves to live in shadows, trying to appease people who'd already made up their minds. "All right," Caleb said. "We tell the truth and ignore the rest." Exactly. That evening, Caleb cooked dinner, a simple meal of fried potatoes and salt pork from Elena's pantry. They ate in silence, Samuel sleeping between feedings. Outside, darkness fell early, as it did in winter. Inside, lamplight pushed back the shadows. It felt almost normal, almost like a family sitting down to supper together. But the empty chair where Mary should have been sat like a ghost at the table, and Caleb knew Elena probably felt the same about her absent husband and dead child. They were playing at normalcy, but underneath ran currents of grief too deep to ignore. After dinner, Elena fed Samuel again while Caleb washed dishes. He heard her humming softly, a lullaby perhaps, or just a tune to soothe the baby. The sound was achingly beautiful and impossibly sad. When she finished, she handed Samuel to Caleb. "You should have some time with him before bed. He needs to know his father's voice, his father's touch." Caleb took his son, still amazed by how light he was, how fragile and strong at the same time. He carried Samuel to the small room that was now theirs and sat in the single chair, cradling the baby against his chest. "Your mama would have loved you so much," he whispered. "She waited for you for so long, wanted you so badly. She'd be so proud of how strong you are." Samuel's eyes were open, dark and unfocused, but seeming to look at Caleb nonetheless, learning his father's face, building memories that wouldn't truly form for months yet, but somehow mattered anyway. "We're going to be okay," Caleb promised. "I don't know how yet, but we will. We'll figure it out. You and me." And Elena, he thought, but didn't say. Because Elena had made it clear this was temporary. When Samuel was weaned, they'd go, return to the ranch, resume their lives, leave her to her grief and empty house. But that was months away. For now, they were here. And for now, that was enough. Caleb sat holding his son until the baby fell asleep, then laid him gently in the basket Elena had provided. Samuel stirred but didn't wake, his small chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of healthy sleep. Through the thin walls, Caleb heard Elena moving in her own room, water pouring into a basin, floorboards creaking, the sounds of another person preparing for bed. They were strangers living under one roof, bound together by circumstance and necessity. But as Caleb lay down on the narrow bed and listened to his son's breathing in the darkness, he felt something shift in his chest. Not happiness. He was too raw for that. But maybe the first stirring of peace, the sense that he wasn't completely alone in this impossible situation. Outside, wind whispered through bare trees, snow shifted on the roof, and in a small house on the edge of Grafton, 3 people who'd lost everything began the slow, painful process of learning how to survive together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, they'd made it through. And sometimes that was all you could ask for. The days that followed established a rhythm neither of them had anticipated. Samuel woke every 3 hours like clockwork, his cries pulling both adults from whatever tasks occupied them. Elena would appear from wherever she was, the kitchen, the garden, her bedroom, and take the baby without a word. Caleb learned to recognize the different tones of his son's cries. Hunger, discomfort, the need to be held. But it was Elena who could soothe him fastest, her practiced hands knowing exactly how to position him, exactly how much pressure to use when patting his back. By the end of the first week, Caleb had ridden out to the ranch 3 times, each trip bringing back more supplies. Clothes that Mary had sewn for the baby, never worn, blankets she'd quilted during the long winter evenings, her rocking chair which Caleb set up in the parlor because Elena's was too small and uncomfortable for extended use. He couldn't bear to leave these things at the ranch, gathering dust in a cabin that echoed with Mary's absence. Elena accepted each item without comment, though Caleb saw her fingers linger on the stitching of Mary's quilts, tracing the careful patterns. She was a woman who understood what it meant to pack away a dead child's belongings. She handled Mary's handiwork with the reverence it deserved. The town's reaction came faster than either of them expected. By the second day, women Caleb had never spoken to were crossing the street to avoid him. By the third, someone had left a note nailed to Elena's door. Harlot. 4 letters, vicious in their simplicity. Elena had torn it down before Caleb could see it, but he'd found the crumpled paper in her kindling box that evening. "Ignore them," Elena said when he confronted her about it. "I told you this would happen." "That doesn't make it right." "No, but getting angry won't change it either." She was folding diapers at the table, her movements precise and controlled. "Save your energy for things that matter." But Caleb saw the way her jaw tightened when she went into town for supplies. how she kept her eyes down and her interactions brief. The cost of helping him was higher than she'd admitted, and it was growing daily. On the 8th day, Reverend Michaels came calling. Caleb was in the yard splitting wood when the Reverend's buggy pulled up. The older man climbed down carefully, his boots crunching in the snow. He was maybe 60, thin and gray-haired, with the kind of face that had seen too much hardship to judge others harshly. Or so Caleb had thought. "Mr. Turner," the Reverend's voice was neutral. "Might I have a word?" Caleb set down the axe. "Of course." "I heard about your wife. I'm deeply sorry for your loss. Mary was a good woman." "She was." "And I understand your son nearly died, that you found help here." The Reverend glanced toward the house. "With Mrs. Moore." "That's right." Caleb kept his voice level. "She saved my son's life." "I don't doubt her kindness, but I'm concerned about the arrangement you've made. Living here, unmarried, with an infant. People are talking, Mr. Turner. The talk isn't kind. People talked about Job too, as I recall. Didn't make them right." The Reverend's expression tightened. "This isn't about righteousness. It's about propriety, about setting an example for the community. My son was starving." Caleb felt anger rising in his chest. "The community refused to help. Mrs. Moore didn't. So forgive me if I don't much care about propriety right now. I understand you're grieving, but grief doesn't excuse..." "Doesn't excuse what?" "Keeping my child alive? Using the help that was offered when everyone else turned their backs?" Caleb took a step forward. "Mary died bringing Samuel into this world. I'll be damned if I let him die to preserve the sensibilities of people who wouldn't lift a finger to save him." The Reverend was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was gentler. "What if there was another way? A widow in my congregation lost her husband last month. She has a young daughter still nursing. She might be willing to help, and you could stay at the boarding house, bring the baby to her for feedings. It would be more, appropriate. Mrs. Carmichael already gave up my room, and I'm not dragging my son across town multiple times a day in this weather. He's thriving here. He's safe. That's what matters. And Mrs. Moore? What about her reputation?" "What about it?" Elena's voice came from the doorway. She stood with Samuel in her arms, her expression calm, but her eyes flashing with something dangerous. "My reputation was destroyed the day my husband left me, Reverend, the day this town decided I was responsible for my own child's death. A few more rumors won't hurt me." "Mrs. Moore, I'm trying to help." "Are you? Because it seems like you're trying to make yourself feel better about the fact that your congregation let a baby nearly die." Elena's voice was ice. "Where were all these concerned Christians when Mr. Turner was begging for help? Where were they when he collapsed on the church steps with his dying son?" The Reverend flushed. "That's not fair." "Fair?" Elena laughed, a bitter sound. "You want to talk about fair? My son died in his sleep. No warning, no sickness, just here one moment and gone the next. My husband blamed me and left. Your congregation crossed the street to avoid me at the funeral. And now you come here to lecture me about propriety because I'm keeping another baby alive. I'm not lecturing. Yes, you are. You're doing exactly what this town does best, punishing people for surviving in ways that make you uncomfortable." She stepped fully outside, still holding Samuel. "This baby needs to eat every 3 hours. I can feed him. That's the entire arrangement. If that offends your sense of decency, Reverend, then perhaps you should examine why feeding a hungry child strikes you as indecent." The Reverend opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked between Elena and Caleb, seemed to realize he'd lost this battle before it began. "I'll pray for you both," he said finally. "Pray for yourself," Elena replied. "We're fine." They watched him drive away in silence. Only when the buggy had disappeared down the road did Elena's shoulders slump slightly. Samuel stirred in her arms, making small, unhappy sounds. "He's hungry," she said quietly. "I should feed him." She went inside without another word. Caleb stood in the yard for a long moment, staring at the Reverend's tracks in the snow. The man had meant well, probably, but good intentions counted for nothing when they came wrapped in judgment. Inside, Elena was already settled in Mary's rocking chair, Samuel nursing contentedly. Caleb hung his coat and moved to the kitchen, needing something to do with his hands. He started coffee, though it was barely past noon. "I'm sorry," he said. I didn't mean to bring this trouble to your door. You didn't bring it. It was already here. Elena's voice was steady, but Caleb heard the exhaustion beneath it. I've been the town pariah for 2 months. At least now I have a reason that actually matters. Caleb poured 2 cups of coffee, brought one to her. She took it with her free hand, careful not to disturb Samuel. They'd developed these small courtesies over the past week, anticipating each other's needs, moving around each other in the limited space, finding ways to make the arrangement work. What if he's right, though? Caleb asked. What if there is another way? A widow who could help without all this complication. Elena looked at him over the rim of her cup. Do you want to leave? No, but I don't want to make your life harder than it already is. My life is what it is. Having you and Samuel here doesn't change the fundamental facts. My son is dead, my husband is gone, and the town hates me. At least with you here, the house doesn't echo quite so much. She paused. Besides, Samuel is thriving. You said it yourself. Why disrupt that? Because people are cruel. Because they'll keep coming, keep pushing, keep trying to force us apart. Let them try. Elena shifted Samuel to her shoulder, patting his back. I've survived worse than gossip. But that evening, after Samuel was asleep and Elena had retired to her room, Caleb heard her crying. Soft, muffled sounds that she was clearly trying to suppress. He stood outside her door, hand raised to knock, wanting to offer comfort, but knowing he had no right. They'd established boundaries, separate rooms, separate lives. He lowered his hand and walked away. The second week brought snow that buried Grafton under 2 feet of white. Caleb couldn't reach the ranch for 3 days, trapped in town by weather that made the roads impassable. He spent the time making himself useful around Elena's house, fixing the leak in the roof he'd noticed, replacing rotted boards in the floor, repairing the fence that surrounded her small garden. Elena watched him work with an expression he couldn't read. Once she brought him coffee while he was on the roof, calling up to him from below. You're going to fall and break your neck, she said. I'll be careful. That's what everyone says right before they fall. But she waited at the bottom of the ladder until he climbed down, and Caleb realized she was worried, actually worried about his safety. The thought warmed him more than the coffee. They were eating supper that night, a simple meal of beans and cornbread, when Samuel started crying. Not his usual hungry cry, but something sharper, more distressed. Elena was on her feet immediately, lifting him from his basket. What's wrong? Caleb asked. I don't know. He feels warm. Elena pressed her lips to Samuel's forehead. Too warm. Fear shot through Caleb's chest. How warm? Is he sick? I'm not sure. It might just be that he's been near the stove, or it might be... She stopped, but Caleb heard the word she didn't say. Fever. They spent the next hour in tense vigil, Elena holding Samuel, Caleb pacing. The baby's temperature seemed to drop slightly, but he remained fussy, refusing to nurse properly. By midnight, both adults were exhausted and terrified. Should I get the doctor? Caleb asked. In this weather, the roads are barely passable and it's the middle of the night. Elena rocked Samuel gently. Let's wait until morning. If he's not better, then yes. But morning brought improvement. Samuel's temperature was normal, and he nursed eagerly, making up for the feeds he'd missed during the night. Elena sagged with relief, and Caleb realized she'd been awake the entire night, monitoring the baby's every breath. You should sleep, he said. I can watch him. You don't know what to look for. Then teach me. Elena hesitated, then nodded slowly. She showed him how to check for fever, how to recognize the signs of distress, what to do if Samuel stopped breathing. Information that felt vital and terrifying in equal measure. If something happens, if he stops breathing or turns blue, you run to Doc Morrison's house. It's 3 streets over, the yellow house with green shutters. You bang on that door until he answers, understood? Understood. Elena went to her room finally, leaving Caleb alone with his son. Samuel slept peacefully now, oblivious to the terror he'd caused. Caleb watched the small chest rise and fall, still not quite believing that this fragile life depended on him. The near sickness changed something between them. Elena started teaching Caleb things she'd been handling alone, how to change diapers properly, how to swaddle Samuel so he felt secure, how to hold him during feeding so he didn't get air in his stomach. Small, practical skills that felt like intimacies. Mary would have been better at this, Caleb said one afternoon, fumbling with a diaper pin. Maybe, but Mary isn't here. You are. Elena guided his hands, showing him the right angle. You're doing fine. I don't feel fine. I feel like I'm one mistake away from disaster. That's called being a parent. Elena's voice was gentle. The fear never really goes away. You just learn to function despite it. Caleb looked at her, seeing the pain behind her words. She'd been a parent. She'd learned those skills. And then she'd lost the child she'd learned them for. Now she was teaching him, preparing him to take Samuel away eventually, to leave her with nothing but an empty house and memories. I'm sorry, he said quietly. For what? For making you do this. For forcing you to relive. You're not forcing me. Elena's expression was firm. I chose this. I'm choosing it every day. Don't take that away from me by turning it into something you did to me. The words hung in the air between them, complicated and true. This arrangement was saving Samuel, yes, but it was also saving Elena in ways Caleb was only beginning to understand. It gave her purpose, structure, a reason to face each morning. Without it, she'd be alone with her grief, drowning in an empty house. They were saving each other, he realized. All three of them. That night, Caleb wrote to his brother in Montana. He hadn't opened the letter that had arrived at Mrs. Carmichael's, hadn't felt ready to face questions about Mary's death and his new life. But now he needed to tell someone what was happening, needed to put words to the strange new reality. The letter took hours to write. He explained Mary's death, Samuel's near starvation, Elena's intervention. He tried to make it sound practical, businesslike, but the words kept slipping towards something more emotional. By the end, he'd filled 4 pages and still hadn't captured the complexity of what he was living. He sealed the letter and set it aside to mail when the roads cleared. Outside, wind howled around the house, but inside, warmth prevailed. Elena sat in Mary's rocking chair, mending one of Caleb's shirts that had torn on a nail. Samuel slept in his basket. It was a domestic scene, almost peaceful. But 3 days later, the fragile peace shattered. Caleb had gone to town for supplies, leaving Samuel with Elena as usual. He was at the general store, paying for flour and coffee, when Dutch Matthews walked in with 2 other men Caleb didn't recognize. Dutch's jaw was still bruised from where Caleb had hit him, a purple and yellow reminder of their encounter. Well, if it isn't the widower, Dutch said loudly. How's your little arrangement working out, Turner? More woman keeping you warm at night? Caleb set down his purchases carefully. Watch your mouth. Or what? You'll hit me again? Dutch grinned. I've got witnesses this time. You lay a hand on me and Sheriff Bennett will lock you up. Then I guess you're safe to say whatever poison you want. It's not poison if it's true. Everyone knows what's going on in that house. Widower and widow playing house, using a baby as an excuse. Caleb's fist was already moving before Dutch finished the sentence. This time, Dutch was ready, dodging sideways. One of the other men grabbed Caleb's arm, twisting it behind his back. That's assault, Dutch said, touching his jaw where Caleb's fist had grazed it. Sheriff! Someone get Sheriff Bennett! The sheriff arrived within minutes, a heavy-set man in his 50s who'd seen too many bar fights to be impressed by this one. He looked at Caleb with disappointment rather than anger. Mr. Turner, this isn't like you. He was insulting Mrs. Moore. I was stating facts, Dutch interjected. Man's living in sin with a woman not his wife, using his baby as a shield. That's enough. The sheriff held up a hand. Dutch, get out of here before I arrest you for disturbing the peace. Turner, you come with me. We need to talk. They walked to the sheriff's office in silence. Once inside, Bennett poured 2 cups of coffee and gestured for Caleb to sit. I'm not going to arrest you, Bennett said, but I can't have you starting fights every time someone says something you don't like. He called her. I know what he called her, and he's wrong, but hitting him won't change his mind, and it won't stop others from talking. The sheriff leaned back in his chair. I knew your wife. Mary was good people, and I know Elena Moore has had a rough time of it. But the situation you're in, it's causing problems. My son was dying. She saved him. What was I supposed to do? I'm not saying you did wrong. I'm saying you need to be smart about how you handle the aftermath. Bennett took a sip of coffee. Have you thought about making the arrangement official? Caleb stared at him. What? Marrying her, making it legal. It would stop the talk, make everything proper in the eyes of the law and the church. I buried my wife 2 weeks ago. I know, and I'm not saying it's ideal, but it would solve a lot of problems. Bennett's expression was sympathetic. Think about it from the town's perspective. Right now, you're a widower living with an unrelated woman. If she were your wife, even just legally, it changes everything. I don't love her. The words came out harsher than Caleb intended. I love Mary. I'll always love Mary. Love's not required for a legal marriage. Plenty of people marry for practical reasons. Land, money, children. This would be for your son's welfare and her reputation. That's practical enough. Caleb stood abruptly. I need to go. Think about it, Bennett called after him. Before this situation gets worse. Caleb walked back to Elena's house in a daze, the sheriff's words echoing in his head. Marriage. To a woman he barely knew. To make their arrangement respectable. To stop the gossip and judgment. It made a terrible kind of sense, but it also felt like a betrayal of everything he'd had with Mary. Their marriage had been built on love, on choosing each other freely. The idea of entering another marriage as a business transaction made his stomach turn. Elena was in the kitchen when he arrived, Samuel sleeping in her arms. She took one look at Caleb's face and frowned. What happened? He told her about the confrontation with Dutch, the sheriff's intervention, the suggestion that had been made. Elena listened without interrupting, her expression growing more closed with each word. Marriage, she said flatly when he finished. That's what Bennett suggested. And what did you say? That I needed time to think about it. Caleb ran a hand through his hair. I don't know what to do. Part of me says he's right. It would solve problems, but the rest of me doesn't want to dishonor your wife's memory by marrying someone you don't love. Elena's voice was understanding but firm. I get it. I feel the same way. You do? My marriage ended badly, but it still meant something once. The idea of marrying again just to satisfy small-minded gossips feels wrong. She shifted Samuel to her other arm. But I also understand the practicality of it. We're already living like a married couple in some ways, sharing a house, caring for a child together. The only thing missing is the legal document. Do you want to get married? Caleb asked bluntly. Elena was quiet for a long moment. I don't want to get married, but I might be willing to do it anyway, if it means Samuel stays safe and healthy and we can stop worrying about the town's judgment. That's as honest as I can be. We'd both be doing it for the wrong reasons. Or we'd be doing it for the only reason that matters, protecting a child. Elena looked down at Samuel. But I won't pressure you. This has to be your choice. Caleb thought about Mary, buried in the cold ground, about the life they'd planned that would never happen, about the vows he'd made to love her until death. Death had come, but love hadn't died with it. He still loved her, still missed her, still felt like part of himself had been torn away. But Samuel was alive and thriving, and that was because of Elena, because she'd opened her door on the worst night of Caleb's life and given them both a chance to survive. She'd asked for nothing in return except the opportunity to help. She deserved better than to be treated as scandalous for her kindness. Let me think about it, he said finally. Can you give me a few days? Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. But 2 days later, the decision was made for them. Caleb woke in the middle of the night to pounding on the door. He stumbled from bed, half asleep, and found Sheriff Bennett on the porch with a grim expression. What's wrong? Caleb asked. Town council met tonight. There's been complaints about your living situation. They've issued an order. Either you marry Mrs. Moore within the week, or you move out and find other arrangements for the baby. Caleb felt ice in his veins. They can't do that. They just did. I'm sorry, Turner. I tried to argue against it, but Dutch Matthews and his friends pushed it through. They're calling it a moral hazard. Bennett looked genuinely apologetic. You have 7 days. The sheriff left, and Caleb stood on the porch staring into darkness. Behind him, he heard Elena's door open, heard her footsteps approaching. I heard, she said quietly. The walls are thin. We could fight this. Get a lawyer. With what money? And what judge in this territory would rule in favor of an unmarried man and woman living together? Elena's voice was pragmatic, but Caleb heard the resignation in it. They've backed us into a corner. I won't force you into a marriage you don't want. And I won't let Samuel suffer because we're too proud to do what's necessary. Elena touched his arm briefly. It doesn't have to mean anything beyond the legal paperwork. We can keep our separate rooms, our separate lives. Just add a marriage certificate to make it official. That's not fair to you. Life's not fair. I learned that when my son died. She stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself against the cold. We have 7 days to decide. Let's use them wisely. They spent those 7 days in careful discussion, negotiating terms like business partners rather than potential spouses. They would marry legally but maintain the boundaries they had established. Separate bedrooms. No romantic expectations. A partnership focused entirely on Samuel's welfare. When he was weaned and old enough, they could divorce quietly and go their separate ways. It should have felt clinical, emotionless. But Caleb found himself watching Elena during those days, seeing her in ways he hadn't before. The patience she showed with Samuel, the quiet strength in how she handled the town's judgment, the way she sang softly while rocking the baby to sleep, her voice carrying a melody that made his chest ache. On the 6th day, Caleb rode to the ranch and stood at Mary's grave. He'd buried her in a small plot behind the cabin, under a cottonwood tree she'd loved. The ground was frozen now, snow covering the fresh earth. I don't know what to do, he told her, speaking to cold stone. The town's forcing my hand, and I don't want to dishonor your memory. But Samuel needs stability. He needs Elena, and I think maybe Elena needs us too, even if she won't admit it. The wind answered, rustling through bare branches. Caleb waited, hoping for some sign, some indication of what Mary would want. But the dead didn't speak, and he was left to make this choice alone. He thought about their last conversation, hours before she went into labor. She'd been excited, nervous, chattering about all the things they'd do as a family, and then she'd grown serious, taking his hand. If something happens to me, she'd said, nothing's going to happen. But if it does, promise me you'll take care of our baby. Promise me you'll do whatever it takes to keep him safe and loved. Caleb had promised, not believing he'd ever have to keep that vow. Now standing at her grave, he understood what she'd been asking. Not that he mourn her forever, not that he preserve her memory at the cost of their son's welfare, but that he do whatever it took, to give Samuel the life she'd wanted for him, even if that meant marrying someone else. I'm sorry, he whispered to the snow-covered ground, but I made you a promise, and I'm going to keep it. On the 7th day, Caleb and Elena stood before Justice of the Peace Williams in his office above the pharmacy. There were no flowers, no guests, no celebration. Just two people speaking vows neither fully believed, witnessed by a board clerk and the justice himself. Do you, Caleb Turner, take Elena Moore to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do. And do you, Elena Moore, take Caleb Turner to be your lawfully wedded husband? Elena's voice was steady. I do. Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I pronounce you husband and wife. No kiss, no congratulations, just signatures on a document that changed everything and nothing. They walked home in silence, now legally married but feeling no different than they had that morning. The only difference was the ring Caleb had bought, a simple silver band that Elena wore on her left hand like a shield against judgment. That night they ate supper as they always did, Samuel sleeping between feeds. The only acknowledgement of what had happened came as they were cleaning up. Thank you, Elena said quietly, for doing this. I know it wasn't easy. You're the one who's sacrificing, Caleb replied. You're tied to a man you barely know, all to stop gossip. We're both sacrificing, but at least now Samuel is protected. That's what matters. She was right. But as Caleb lay in his separate room that night, listening to his wife, moving in her own space, he felt the strange weight of what they'd done. They'd married to satisfy others, to protect a child, to survive in a world that punished unconventional arrangements. But somewhere in the practical negotiations and legal paperwork, something had shifted. They were partners now, bound by law and necessity, and Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that they'd crossed a line they could never uncross, even if they tried. In the next room, Samuel began to cry. Caleb heard Elena's door open, heard her footsteps, heard the gentle murmur of her voice as she soothed the baby. His son, her patient, their shared responsibility, their family, however it had been formed. Caleb closed his eyes and tried not to think about what Mary would say if she could see him now. Tried not to think about the future, when Elena would want to end this arrangement and reclaim her life. Tried not to think about how the sound of her lullaby through the thin walls had become something he listened for, something that eased the sharp edges of his grief. They'd done what was necessary. Nothing more, nothing less. But as sleep finally claimed him, Caleb dreamed of two women, one dead, one living, and a baby who'd somehow bound them all together across the boundary of life and death. And when he woke to Samuel's cry in the darkness, it was Elena's voice he heard answering, steady and sure, promising comfort to a child who would never remember this time, but who was being shaped by it nonetheless. 7 days. That's all it had taken to go from strangers to married partners. 7 days to build something that looked like a family from the outside, even if the inside was still hollow with grief and uncertainty. But it was enough. For now, it was enough. The marriage certificate changed nothing about their daily routine, but it changed everything about how Grafton treated them. The hostile stares softened slightly. Women still crossed the street, but now they nodded curtly instead of looking away entirely. Dutch Matthews kept his distance, though his eyes still followed Caleb with barely concealed contempt whenever their paths crossed. Respectability, Caleb learned, was a thin veneer easily applied by a piece of paper and just as easily stripped away by circumstance. 3 weeks into the marriage, Elena received a letter from her sister in Illinois. Caleb found her in the kitchen that afternoon. The letter crumpled in her fist, her face pale and tight with anger. "What's wrong?" he asked. Elena smoothed the letter out on the table, her hands shaking slightly. "My sister heard about the marriage. Somehow word reached Illinois." She laughed bitterly. "She's concerned about my well-being, thinks I've been taken advantage of by a desperate widower, suggests I come stay with her until I can think clearly about my situation." Caleb read over her shoulder, seeing the barely concealed judgment in every line. The sister, Catherine, wrote in the careful language of someone trying to sound supportive while actually being deeply critical. She questioned whether Elena was truly ready for another marriage so soon after her loss, wondered if Caleb was the kind of man who values you for yourself or merely for the service you can provide. "I'm sorry," Caleb said. "She doesn't understand the situation. She doesn't want to understand. She wants to believe I'm being used because that fits the narrative she's always had about me. Poor Elena, making bad choices. Poor Elena, married to a man who abandoned her. Poor Elena, so desperate for purpose that she'd trap herself with a widower and his baby." Elena crumpled the letter again. "She doesn't know that I chose this, that I'm choosing it every day." "You could write back, explain. What would I say? That we married to avoid scandal? That we sleep in separate rooms and live separate lives? That this whole thing is a practical arrangement that will end the moment Samuel doesn't need me anymore?" Elena's voice cracked slightly. "She'd use that as proof that I'm being used." Caleb pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "Are you? Being used?" Elena met his eyes directly. "Are you using me?" "No. I'm grateful for your help, but I never wanted to trap you into anything. You could leave tomorrow if you wanted. I'd figure something out." "And you think I don't know that?" Elena's expression softened slightly. "That's the difference between you and my former husband. He needed me to need him, to be helpless so he could feel important. You'd let me walk away even if it made your life harder. That's not using someone. That's respecting them." The words hung between them, intimate in a way their relationship had carefully avoided. Caleb found himself noticing small details he'd been trying not to see. The way lamplight caught in Elena's dark hair, the strength in her hands as they gripped the edge of the table, the intelligence in her eyes that the town had tried so hard to diminish. "Don't respond to your sister," he said finally. "At least not now. Let her believe what she wants. People who've decided to judge you won't be swayed by explanations." Elena nodded slowly. "You're right. I just wish—" She stopped, shaking her head. "Never mind what I wish. Wishes are for children." But Caleb heard the longing beneath her pragmatism, the wish to be understood, to be seen as something other than pitiable or scandalous. He understood that wish intimately because he carried the same one. That night, after Samuel was fed and sleeping, Caleb sat at the small desk in his room and wrote a letter of his own. Not to Elena's sister, but to his brother in Montana. The letter he'd started weeks ago had never been sent, but now he finished it, trying to capture the complexity of what he was living. "I know this sounds strange," he wrote. "A marriage of convenience to a woman I barely knew a month ago. But it's not what you're thinking. Elena is not taking advantage of my grief, and I'm not taking advantage of her kindness. We're two people who lost everything finding a way to survive together. Maybe that's not love, but it's something. Something worth protecting." He sealed the letter and set it aside, knowing he probably wouldn't send this one either. Some things were too complicated to explain in words. The next morning brought the first real warmth Grafton had seen in weeks. Snow began to melt, creating rivers of muddy water in the streets. Icicles dripped from roof lines. And with the thaw came visitors. Margaret Flynn arrived first, the postmaster's daughter who'd directed Caleb to Elena's door that terrible night. She stood on the porch with a basket of preserves and an awkward smile. "Mrs. Turner," she said when Elena answered, "I wanted to congratulate you on your marriage and to apologize for not visiting sooner." Elena's surprise was evident. "There's nothing to apologize for." "Yes, there is. I should have come before, should have shown support when people were talking, but I was a coward." Margaret held out the basket. "These are from my mother's recipe. She always made them for special occasions." Elena took the basket, her expression carefully neutral. "Thank you. Would you like to come in?" They sat in the parlor, an uncomfortable silence stretching until Margaret spoke again. "I know what people are saying about you, about both of you, and I know most of it's nonsense. What you did for Mr. Turner and his baby, that was Christian kindness, the kind this town claims to value but rarely practices." "The town made sure we married," Elena said quietly. "Made it impossible for us to continue any other way." "I know, and I'm ashamed of that. But for what it's worth, some of us are glad you're together. Samuel is thriving, anyone can see that. And you both look less haunted than you did a month ago. That counts for something." Caleb, standing in the kitchen doorway, was struck by Margaret's words. Less haunted. Was that true? He caught his reflection in the window glass, still gaunt from grief, still carrying shadows under his eyes. But maybe there was something different, a slight easing in the set of his shoulders, a fractional decrease in the weight he carried. Margaret didn't stay long, but her visit cracked open a door. Over the following weeks, a few other women came calling. Not many. Grafton was still a judgmental place, and most people still avoided the Turner household like it carried plague. But a handful of women, mostly ones who'd suffered their own losses and understood grief's strange mathematics, made quiet gestures of support. Mrs. Henderson, the old midwife who'd first turned Caleb away, arrived with a sack of flour and a gruff apology. "I should have helped," she said. "I was too focused on what I couldn't do instead of finding what I could. I'm sorry." Elena accepted each visit with the same careful politeness, never quite letting her guard down, but Caleb could see the slight thaw in her demeanor. She wasn't so alone anymore, neither of them were. But acceptance from a few didn't mean acceptance from all. Dutch Matthews and his circle continued their campaign of whispers and sidelong glances. The Reverend stopped visiting, which Caleb took as either disapproval or defeat. And there were still those who made their contempt obvious. 4 weeks after the marriage, Caleb was in town buying supplies when he overheard 2 women talking outside the dry goods store. "It's unnatural," one said, "using that baby to replace the one she lost. She'll probably smother it in its sleep like she did her own." Caleb's vision went red. He was moving toward them before he could think, but a hand on his arm stopped him. He turned to find Sheriff Bennett, his expression weary. "Don't," the sheriff said quietly. "It'll only make things worse." "You heard what she said." "I heard, and it's vile. But you can't fight every ignorant comment in this town. You'll spend your whole life swinging fists and accomplish nothing." Bennett steered him away from the women. "How's the baby doing?" The change of subject threw Caleb off balance. "He's well, getting bigger every day." "And Elena?" "She's managing." "That's not what I asked." Bennett's gaze was penetrating. "How is she?" "Really?" Caleb thought about Elena's careful distance, the way she held herself apart even as she gave everything to Samuel's care, the nights he heard her crying through the walls, the way she sometimes stared at nothing with an expression of profound loss. "She's surviving," he said finally. "Same as me." "Surviving's not the same as living," Bennett observed, "but I suppose it's a start." They walked in silence for a moment, then the sheriff spoke again. "There's going to be a dance next month, spring celebration. Town throws it every year. You should bring Elena." "She won't want to go." "Maybe not, but maybe she needs to be asked, needs to know she's still part of this community, even if part of the community acts like fools." Bennett clapped him on the shoulder. "Think about it." Caleb did think about it, all the way home. The idea of taking Elena to a public dance seemed absurd. They barely spoke beyond practical matters about Samuel, barely acknowledged the marriage that bound them legally. How could they present themselves as a couple to the town when they weren't truly a couple at all? But that evening, watching Elena rock Samuel to sleep, her voice soft with a lullaby Caleb was beginning to recognize, he found himself speaking before he could reconsider. "There's a dance next month, a spring celebration. Sheriff thinks we should attend." Elena's hand stilled on the rocking chair. "Why would we do that?" "To show the town we're not ashamed, to stop hiding like we've done something wrong. Haven't we? Married under duress, living a lie?" "We're not living a lie. We're legally married. We share a household and care for a child together. That's more real than half the marriages in this town, whatever our sleeping arrangements." Elena was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on Samuel's sleeping face. "I don't dance anymore. Haven't since before my son was born." "Neither have I, not since Mary died." Caleb moved closer, drawn by something he couldn't name. "But maybe that's exactly why we should go. Show ourselves that we're still alive, still capable of existing in the world. Or we could just stay here, where it's safe." "Is it, though, safe?" Caleb gestured toward the walls, beyond which Grafton judged and whispered. "Every time you go to town, people stare. Every time I'm at the market, someone has a comment. We can hide here and let them think we're ashamed, or we can face them directly." Elena looked up at him then, her expression complex. "You want to fight. You've always wanted to fight them." "No. I want to stop caring what they think. There's a difference." She considered this, then nodded slowly. "All right. We'll go to the dance, but if anyone says one cruel word about my dead son or your dead wife, I'm leaving. I won't stay and smile through that." "Fair enough." The next 4 weeks passed in a strange limbo of preparation and dread. Elena dug out a dress she hadn't worn in over a year, a simple blue cotton that had fit before pregnancy. Now it hung slightly loose, testament to the weight she'd lost in grief. She altered it at the kitchen table, her needle flashing in lamplight while Samuel slept nearby. Caleb watched her work, struck by the domesticity of it. This was what married life looked like from the outside. A woman sewing, a baby sleeping, a man reading the newspaper by the fire. Normal. Ordinary. Except nothing about their situation was ordinary, and the performance they were preparing for felt increasingly surreal. "What was your wedding like?" Elena asked one evening, breaking the comfortable silence. "With Mary." Caleb set down his paper, surprised by the question. They rarely spoke about their previous spouses, as if mentioning them would somehow violate the boundaries they'd established. "Small," he said finally. "Just us, a justice of the peace, and 2 strangers we pulled off the street to witness. We couldn't afford anything fancy." "But you loved her." "More than anything." Elena's hand stilled on her sewing. "That must make this harder, being married to someone you don't love." "I don't not love you," Caleb said, then stopped, realizing how that sounded. "I mean, I care about you. I'm grateful for everything you've done. That's not nothing. But it's not love." "No." The admission felt like a betrayal, though he didn't know who he was betraying. "Is that what you want? Love?" Elena laughed, a sharp sound without humor. "I don't know what I want anymore. Some days I think I just want to feel something other than this constant ache. Other days I think the ache is all I have left of my son, and losing it would mean losing him completely." Caleb understood that paradox intimately. Grief was pain, yes, but it was also connection. To let go of the pain felt like letting go of the person who caused it. He carried Mary's absence like a wound that wouldn't heal, and part of him didn't want it to heal because then she'd truly be gone. "We're a pair," he said quietly, "both of us more comfortable with our dead than our living." Except for Samuel, Elena's expression softened as she looked at the sleeping baby. He's completely alive, completely present, no ghosts, no grief, just hunger and growth and trust that his needs will be met. You've given him that. The trust. We've given him that. You're his father. That matters. But Caleb had noticed how Samuel responded to Elena versus himself. The baby would calm instantly in her arms, would root toward her when hungry, would track her movements across a room. With Caleb, Samuel was comfortable but not preferential. He was learning his father's voice and face, but it was Elena's he sought for comfort. It should have bothered Caleb more than it did. Instead, he found himself grateful that his son had someone who could provide that maternal presence, even if it was temporary, even if it couldn't last. The night before the dance, Caleb found Elena standing at the window, staring out at the darkened street. Samuel was asleep, and the house was quiet except for the creak of settling wood. "Having second thoughts?" Caleb asked. "Thousands of them." Elena didn't turn from the window. "This is a mistake. We should stay home." "Probably, but we're going anyway." "Why? Why does it matter what they think?" Caleb moved to stand beside her, following her gaze to the empty street. "It doesn't matter what they think, but it matters what we think about ourselves. If we hide, we're accepting their judgment. We're agreeing that we've done something shameful." "Haven't we, though?" Elena's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm feeding another woman's baby, living with her husband, wearing her ring." She touched the silver band on her finger. "This was Mary's, wasn't it?" Caleb felt ice in his chest. "How did you know?" "It's too worn to be new, and I've seen you looking at it with that expression, the one that says you're remembering someone you lost." Elena finally turned to face him. "You gave me your dead wife's ring." "I'm sorry. I should have told you. I should have bought a new one, but money was tight and it seemed practical." "Don't." Elena held up a hand. "Don't apologize for being practical. That's what this whole arrangement is, isn't it? Practical." But her voice cracked on the last word, and Caleb saw moisture in her eyes. "Elena, I need to sleep. Tomorrow will be difficult enough without adding exhaustion." She moved past him toward her bedroom, then stopped at the door. "For what it's worth, I don't think we've done anything shameful. Samuel is alive because we helped each other. That's not shame, that's survival." She closed the door before Caleb could respond. He stood in the empty parlor, Mary's ring burning like an accusation on his conscience. He'd given it to Elena without thinking, treating the symbol of his first marriage as nothing more than a convenient prop for his second. What did that say about him? About how quickly he was willing to let Mary's memory fade? But when he went to bed that night, it was Elena's tears he couldn't stop thinking about. Not Mary's ghost, but the living woman in the next room who'd shown such strength in the face of impossible circumstances. Who'd saved his son and asked for nothing in return except to be left alone with her grief when this was over. They were using each other, he realized. But maybe that was all right. Maybe two broken people leaning on each other was better than two broken people falling alone. The dance was held in the town hall, a large wooden building that served as church, meeting place, and social center. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting warm light over tables laden with food brought by various families. A small group of musicians, fiddle, guitar, and accordion, occupied one corner, tuning their instruments. Caleb and Elena arrived late, hoping to slip in unnoticed. Instead, conversation died as they entered, every head turning to stare. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Margaret Flynn crossed the room and took Elena's hands. "Mrs. Turner, I'm so glad you came. And don't you look lovely in that dress?" The moment broke. Conversation resumed, though at a lower volume, and Caleb was acutely aware of the whispers following them as they made their way inside. He kept his hand at Elena's elbow, a gesture that looked protective but was actually just as much for his own steadiness. They found seats near the refreshment table, neither quite brave enough to venture onto the dance floor. Caleb watched other couples moving through the patterns of a simple waltz, remembering the last time he'd danced. It had been with Mary, at a harvest celebration 2 years ago. She'd been laughing, her face flushed with exertion and joy, completely alive and present, and his. "You're thinking about her," Elena said quietly. "Am I that obvious?" "Only to someone who's thinking about the same thing. Different person, same absence." They sat in shared understanding, two widowed hearts pretending to be whole. Around them, Grafton celebrated spring with music and dancing and the simple joy of community. But Caleb and Elena existed apart from it, observers rather than participants. "We should dance," Caleb said suddenly. "Just once. Show them we can." Elena looked at him like he'd suggested they burn the building down. "I don't think—" "One dance, then we can leave." He stood and offered his hand. "Please." For a moment he thought she'd refuse. Then she placed her hand in his and let him lead her to the floor. The musician started a new song, something slow and simple. Caleb put his hand at Elena's waist, feeling her stiffen at the contact. They began to move, awkward and uncertain, two people who'd shared a house for weeks but had never been this close. "Everyone's watching," Elena murmured. "Let them watch." They turned slowly, finding the rhythm. Elena's hand in his was warm, calloused from work. She smelled faintly of the lavender soap she used, and Caleb realized with a start that this was the closest he'd been to another person since Mary died. The intimacy of it was both comforting and deeply uncomfortable. "This was a mistake," Elena said. "We should go." "One more minute. We're already here." But before the minute could pass, Dutch Matthews appeared at the edge of the floor, his voice carrying over the music. "Well, ain't this sweet? The grieving widow and widower playing house. Tell me, Turner, does she cry for her dead baby when you're—" Caleb's fist connected with Dutch's jaw before he could finish. This time he put his full weight behind it, and Dutch went down hard, blood spraying from his nose. The music stopped. Women gasped. Men surged forward. "Don't you ever," Caleb said, his voice deadly quiet, "speak about her son. Don't you mention him? Don't you think about him? Don't you use his death as ammunition for your petty hate? Are we clear?" Dutch scrambled backward, his hand to his bleeding nose. "You're crazy. All of you saw he attacked me." Sheriff Bennett pushed through the crowd, his expression grim. "I saw Dutch Matthews insult a lady and get exactly what he deserved. Anyone else see different?" Silence. Then Margaret Flynn spoke up. "I saw Mr. Matthews harass Mrs. Turner. I heard what he said about her deceased child. If anyone should be removed from this dance, it's him." A murmur of agreement rippled through some of the crowd. Not everyone. Plenty of faces still held judgment and disapproval. But enough people nodded that Bennett felt comfortable hauling Dutch to his feet. "You're done here, Matthews. Go home and cool off." Dutch looked around for support, found none willing to speak up, and left with a final venomous glare at Caleb and Elena. The musicians started playing again, conversation slowly resuming, but Caleb felt Elena trembling beside him, saw tears streaming down her face. Not from Dutch's words, he realized, but from the defense Margaret and others had offered, the unexpected solidarity. "I need air," Elena whispered. They left the hall together, stepping into the cool spring night. Elena walked quickly, not stopping until they'd reached the edge of town where her house stood dark and quiet. Only then did she turn to face him, her expression raw. "You shouldn't have hit him. He deserved it." "Maybe. But now you've made an enemy. A real one." Elena wrapped her arms around herself. "You can't keep fighting my battles. Eventually I have to learn to fight them myself. Or we fight them together. We're married, remember? What hurts you hurts Samuel, and what hurts Samuel hurts me. That makes your battles mine whether you like it or not." Elena stared at him, something shifting in her expression. "When did this become real to you, this marriage?" "I don't know. Somewhere between the legal ceremony and tonight, I guess." Caleb ran a hand through his hair. "It started as convenience, but maybe it's becoming something else, something neither of us planned." "I can't," Elena said, her voice breaking. "I can't let this be real, because real things can be lost, and I've lost too much already. I can't survive losing anything else." "You won't lose Samuel, I promise you. You can't promise that. You don't control the future any more than I do." Elena's composure shattered completely. My son was healthy one day and dead the next. Mary was alive in the morning and gone by evening. We don't get to keep the things we love, Caleb. Life takes them away. She was crying fully now, all the grief she'd held back for months pouring out. Caleb moved without thinking, pulling her into his arms. She resisted for a moment, then collapsed against him, her whole body shaking with sobs. He held her while she wept for her dead son, her failed marriage, the cruel town and the impossibly hard life she'd been handed. And somewhere in holding her, Caleb felt his own walls cracking. He'd been so focused on Samuel's survival that he'd forgotten to acknowledge his own grief, forgotten to mourn Mary properly, forgotten to feel anything except the desperate need to keep moving forward. But Elena's tears unleashed his own, and they stood together in the darkness, two people finally allowing themselves to break. Eventually the storm passed, leaving them both exhausted and quiet. Elena pulled back, wiping her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be. I needed that too." They walked home in silence, but it was different than before. Less careful, less guarded. They'd seen each other at their most vulnerable, and somehow that had created a new foundation for whatever they were building. At the house, Samuel was awake and fussing. Mrs. Henderson had agreed to watch him during the dance, and she met them at the door with relief evident on her face. "He's been crying for 20 minutes, won't settle for anyone but his mama." Elena took the baby, and Samuel quieted immediately, rooting toward her even though he'd been fed before they left. Elena settled into the rocking chair and began nursing while Mrs. Henderson let herself out. Caleb sat across from them, watching. His wife and son, legal definitions that were slowly becoming emotional realities. He'd married Elena to satisfy the town's demands, but watching her now, her face soft in lamplight as she fed his child, he felt something shift irrevocably in his chest. "What are you thinking?" Elena asked without looking up. "That maybe we're not as broken as we thought, or maybe we're just broken in compatible ways." A small smile touched Elena's lips. "That's either very wise or very sad. Can it be both? With us? Probably." Samuel finished feeding and fell asleep against Elena's shoulder. She didn't move to put him in his basket, just sat holding him, as if afraid to let go. Caleb understood. Every moment with Samuel felt precious because they both knew how quickly a child could be lost. "We don't have to stay in Grafton," Caleb said quietly. "We could leave. Go to Denver or even California. Start over somewhere nobody knows our history. Run away. Start fresh." Elena considered this, her hand moving in slow circles on Samuel's back. "And what would we be starting? This arrangement is temporary, remember? When Samuel's weaned, we go our separate ways." "Do we, though?" Caleb leaned forward. "Look at us, Elena. We're already a family in every way that matters. We share a home, share responsibilities, care for this child together. We've defended each other against the town's judgment. We've held each other while we cried. That's not temporary. That's real. I don't know if I can do real again. Real hurts too much when it ends. But what if it doesn't end? What if we stop planning for dissolution and start building something that lasts?" Elena looked at him directly, her eyes searching his face. "You don't love me. You love Mary. You'll always love Mary." "You're right. I will always love Mary. Just like you'll always love your son and probably some part of your former husband despite how he treated you. But that doesn't mean we can't love other people too. Love isn't finite. It doesn't run out." "You're talking about love like it's a choice, like we can just decide to feel it. Isn't it? I chose to marry you. I'm choosing every day to stay, to build this life with you. Maybe that's what love is after loss, a choice to keep choosing someone, even when it's hard." Silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility and fear. Then Samuel stirred, making a small sound, and the moment broke. "I need to put him down," Elena said softly. "He's getting heavy." She rose and carried Samuel to his basket, settling him with practiced care. Caleb watched, knowing he'd pushed too hard, asked for too much too soon. But he couldn't take the words back, and he wasn't sure he wanted to. When Elena returned, she didn't sit. Instead, she stood near the door to her room, her hand on the frame. "I'm not ready," she said. For any of this to be more than it is, I'm sorry if that's not what you want to hear, but I have to be honest. I understand. Do you? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're trying to replace Mary with me, and I won't be someone's substitute. The accusation stung because it held a grain of truth. Was he trying to rebuild what he'd lost? Create a new version of the life Mary's death had stolen? Or was he genuinely seeing Elena for who she was? A woman distinct from his dead wife, valuable in her own right? You're nothing like Mary, Caleb said quietly. She was soft where you're hard, trusting where you're wary. She saw the best in people even when they didn't deserve it. You see them clearly, flaws and all. You're not a replacement for her. You're entirely yourself. Elena's expression softened slightly. Then give me time to figure out who that self is. I've been a wife, a mother, a widow, a pariah. Now I'm your legal wife and Samuel's wet nurse. But I don't know who Elena is underneath all those roles, and until I do, I can't promise you anything beyond what we already have. It was fair, more than fair. And Caleb nodded, accepting the boundary she was setting even as part of him wanted to push against it. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. Elena studied his face for a long moment, then nodded and went to her room, closing the door softly behind her. Caleb sat alone in the lamplight, the house quiet except for Samuel's soft breathing. Tonight had changed things, the dance, the confrontation, the conversation. They'd crossed lines they couldn't uncross, said things that couldn't be unsaid. Whether that led them towards something real or pushed them further apart remained to be seen. But for the first time since Mary's death, Caleb felt something other than grief. It wasn't happiness exactly, and it wasn't peace, but it was possibility. The sense that maybe, just maybe, there was a future worth building beyond simple survival. In the next room, he heard Elena moving around, preparing for bed. His wife, his partner in this strange arrangement they'd created, and somewhere in the weeks of living together, caring for Samuel together, defending each other against the world's judgment, something had shifted. The boundaries they'd established were still there, but they'd become more permeable, more open to change. Caleb went to his own room, but before he closed the door, he looked once more at Samuel, his son, alive and thriving because two grieving people had found each other at exactly the right moment. Because Elena had opened her door on the worst night of Caleb's life and given them both a chance at survival. They'd done more than survive, though. They'd built something. What exactly it was remained undefined, unfinished. But it was theirs, constructed from grief and necessity, and slowly, so slowly, growing into something that might someday be called a family. The future was uncertain. The town's judgment still stung. Elena's walls were still up, protecting a heart that had been broken too many times. But they had time. They had Samuel. And they had each other. Whether either of them was quite ready to admit what that meant, it was enough. For now, it was enough. And as Caleb finally let sleep claim him, he dreamed not of the past, but of tomorrow, of coffee shared in morning light, of Samuel's laughter as he grew, of Elena's slow smile when she thought no one was watching. Dreams not of what was lost, but of what might still be found. Spring arrived in earnest, transforming Grafton from a frozen wasteland into something green and possible. Wildflowers pushed through the last patches of snow. The river that ran through town swelled with snowmelt, its voice a constant rushing backdrop to daily life. And Samuel, now 3 months old, began to change in ways that marked the passage from newborn to infant. He smiled now. Real smiles that lit up his entire face when Elena or Caleb came into view. He tracked movement with focused attention, following sounds with his eyes. His hands had discovered each other, and he spent long minutes studying his own fingers as if they were the most fascinating things in existence. He was growing stronger, filling out, becoming unmistakably himself rather than just a generic baby fighting for survival. Elena documented each change with the attention that bordered on obsessive. She'd acquired a small journal and wrote in it each evening after Samuel was asleep, recording milestones and observations. Caleb had glimpsed the entries once when she'd left it open on the table. Today Samuel laughed for the first time. A real laugh, not just gas or reflex. Caleb was making faces at him, and Samuel thought it was the funniest thing in the world. The sound filled the whole house. I haven't heard laughter in this house since before my son died. I'd forgotten what it sounded like. The words had struck Caleb deeply, revealing how much Elena had invested in Samuel despite her insistence on maintaining distance. She was protecting herself against inevitable loss, yes, but she was also falling in love with the baby she'd saved, and that complicated everything. The ranch demanded Caleb's attention as spring progressed. Fences needed mending, cattle needed moving to better pasture, and the vegetable garden Mary had planted needed someone to tend it if they were going to eat come winter. Caleb spent his days riding between town and the ranch, trying to maintain both properties while still being present for Samuel's care. On one of these rides, he detoured past Mary's grave. The snow had melted, revealing the simple wooden cross he'd erected. Wildflowers were starting to bloom around the site, their bright colors incongruous against the reality of death beneath the soil. "I'm figuring it out," Caleb said to the silent ground. "Samuel's thriving, growing every day. You'd be amazed by him, Mary. He's got your eyes, I think. And maybe your stubborn streak. He knows what he wants and isn't shy about demanding it." The wind answered, carrying the scent of new grass and possibility. Caleb had stopped expecting responses from the dead. They didn't speak, didn't offer guidance. The dead were silent, and the living had to find their own way forward. "I think I'm falling in love with her," he continued, the words coming easier to a grave than they would to a living person. "Not the way I loved you. Nothing could be that. But something real, nonetheless. She makes me want to be better than my grief. She makes me think there might be a future worth building. I hope that's all right with you. I hope wherever you are, you want Samuel and me to be happy." He stayed a while longer, then rode back to town as the sun began its descent. Elena was in the garden when he arrived, Samuel in a basket beside her, protected from the sun by a makeshift canopy. She was planting seedlings with intense concentration, her hands dark with rich soil. "You didn't have to do that," Caleb said, dismounting. "The garden's my responsibility." "I needed the air, and the work." Elena sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her forehead and leaving a streak of dirt. "Besides, this garden was Mary's. It seems wrong to let it go untended." Caleb knelt beside her, examining the neat rows of tomato plants. She'd appreciate that. She loved growing things, said it was proof that life continues even when everything feels dead. She sounds like she was wise. She was. About most things. Caleb paused, choosing his words carefully. "She'd like you, I think. You're both stronger than you believe yourselves to be." Elena's hands stilled in the soil. "Don't do that. Don't make her approve of me from beyond the grave. I'm not asking for her blessing. I'm not offering it on her behalf. I'm just saying I think you would have liked each other. Two women who understood what it meant to survive hard things. I'm not trying to replace her. I know, but you're not trying to disappear either, and that's what you've been doing for the past 4 months, treating yourself as temporary, as if you're just passing through our lives and will disappear the moment Samuel doesn't need you anymore." Elena resumed planting, her movements sharp and precise. "That was the agreement. When he's weaned, I step back." "Agreements can change. People can change." Caleb reached out and stilled her hands with his own, forcing her to look at him. "I don't want you to step back, Elena. I want you to stay, permanently, as my actual wife, not just legally." "You don't know what you're asking." "I know exactly what I'm asking. I'm asking you to take a risk on something real, to stop protecting yourself against loss and start living towards something better." Elena pulled her hands free, standing abruptly. Samuel stirred in his basket, and she picked him up automatically, holding him against her shoulder. "And what happens when it falls apart? When you realize I'm not who you thought I was, or when the grief catches up with both of us and we can't stand to look at each other anymore? Then we deal with it together, like we've been dealing with everything else." "You make it sound simple. It's not simple." Elena's voice rose slightly, and Samuel whimpered. She lowered it immediately, rocking him gently. "I watched my husband walk away because he couldn't handle my grief. I buried my own child and had to do it alone because everyone in this town decided I was responsible. I've spent 2 months being called a harlot and a homewrecker for the crime of keeping your son alive. And now you want me to open myself up to more pain by pretending this could be a real marriage? It already is a real marriage. The only thing pretend about it is the wall you've built between us." Caleb stood, facing her directly. I'm not your former husband. I won't leave when things get hard because things are already hard. And I'm still here. And yes, maybe we're both still grieving. Maybe we'll always be grieving to some extent. But we can grieve together or we can grieve alone. I know which one I prefer. Elena was crying now, tears streaming silently down her face. I'm scared. I'm so tired of being scared. Caleb closed the distance between them, wrapping his arms around both Elena and Samuel. She resisted for a moment, then leaned into him, her head against his shoulder, the baby pressed between them. They stood that way for a long time, three people holding each other up against the weight of all they'd lost and all they stood to lose. I can't promise it won't hurt, Caleb said quietly, but I can promise you won't face it alone. Elena nodded against his shoulder, and Caleb felt something fundamental shift between them. Not a resolution exactly, but an opening, a willingness to consider possibilities that had seemed impossible just moments before. That night, after Samuel was fed and sleeping, Elena appeared at Caleb's bedroom door. She stood in the threshold, her expression uncertain but determined. I've been thinking about what you said, about this being real. She paused, gathering courage. I don't know if I can love you the way you loved Mary. I don't know if I'm capable of that kind of love anymore. But I can try. If you're willing to be patient with me. Caleb crossed the room and took her hands. I don't need you to love me like Mary did. I need you to love me like Elena does. Whatever that looks like. I don't know what that looks like yet. Then we'll figure it out together. Elena's smile was tentative but genuine. You're annoyingly optimistic for someone who's buried a wife. And you're annoyingly practical for someone who just agreed to take a chance on love. I didn't say love, I said try. It's a start. They stood close but not touching, the space between them charged with possibility. Then Elena stepped back, her cheeks slightly flushed. I should sleep. Samuel will be up in a few hours. Elena? Caleb waited until she turned back. Thank you for being willing to try. She nodded and disappeared down the hallway, leaving Caleb alone with a feeling he hadn't experienced in months. Hope. The changes came gradually after that night. Elena didn't move into Caleb's room, but she stopped treating the marriage as purely transactional. They began eating meals together with intentionality rather than convenience. They talked about more than just Samuel's needs, about their pasts, their fears, their tentative hopes for the future. Small touches became more frequent, hands brushing as they passed items, shoulders touching as they sat together, the casual intimacy of two people learning to be comfortable in each other's space. The town noticed. Margaret Flynn commented on it one day at the market, her expression knowing. You two look different, she said to Elena. Lighter, somehow. I don't know what you mean. Yes, you do. You're not just surviving anymore. You're living. Margaret smiled. It's good to see. But not everyone approved. Dutch Matthews, his nose still slightly crooked from Caleb's punch, made his displeasure known through glares and muttered comments. And one afternoon, he cornered Caleb outside the general store. Heard you're playing Happy Family now. How convenient for you, Turner. Dead wife barely cold, and you've got a replacement warming your bed. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. My personal life is none of your concern. It's the whole town's concern when you're setting a bad example. Marrying in haste, living in sin before that, using a baby as an excuse. The only sin here is your jealousy. Caleb stepped closer, not threatening, but not backing down either. You can't stand that Mary chose me over you. You can't stand that Elena chose to help me when the rest of the town turned away. And you especially can't stand that we're building something good from tragedy while you're still nursing your bitterness. Dutch's face flushed red. You think you're better than everyone else? No, I think I'm a man trying to raise his son and build a life with a good woman. That's all. If that offends you, that's your problem, not mine. Caleb turned to leave, then stopped. Mary used to say that holding on to anger was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. You might want to think about that. He walked away, leaving Dutch sputtering behind him. The confrontation should have left him rattled, but instead Caleb felt strangely calm. He'd spent months caring what the town thought, letting their judgment dictate his choices. But somewhere along the way, he'd stopped needing their approval. Elena and Samuel were his family now. Their opinion was the only one that mattered. When he arrived home, he found Elena teaching Samuel to grasp objects, a small wooden rattle that had belonged to her son. She held it just out of reach, encouraging Samuel to extend his chubby hands toward it. When he finally managed to grab it, Elena laughed with genuine delight. "Did you see that? He's getting so coordinated." Caleb sat beside them, watching. "That was your son's, wasn't it? The rattle." Elena's expression shifted, becoming more complex. "Yes, I almost threw it away a dozen times, but I couldn't, and now I'm glad I kept it." She looked at Caleb. "Is that wrong? Giving my dead child's toy to your son?" "I don't think it's wrong. I think it's beautiful. A way of honoring your son's memory while helping Samuel grow." "Sometimes I feel guilty," Elena admitted quietly, "for loving Samuel, like I'm being disloyal to the baby I lost." "Love isn't disloyal. You're not replacing your son with Samuel. You're making room for both of them in your heart." Elena was quiet for a moment, then handed the rattle to Samuel, who immediately tried to eat it. "Caleb, when I'm ready, when I can talk about him without breaking, will you want to hear about my son?" "Of course. I want to know everything about him. His name, what he looked like, the kind of mother you were to him. All of it." Tears slipped down Elena's cheeks, but she was smiling. "His name was Daniel. Daniel James Moore. He had dark hair like mine and blue eyes like his father's, and he made this small huffing sound when he slept, almost like a laugh. I used to lie awake just listening to it, thinking it was the most perfect sound in the world." Caleb reached out and took her hand, squeezing gently. "Tell me more." And she did. For the next hour, while Samuel played with Daniel's rattle, Elena talked about her son. The stories poured out, memories she'd been holding locked away, because sharing them felt impossible without someone who would truly listen. But Caleb listened, and he asked questions, and he held her when the memories became too painful to continue. When she finally fell silent, exhausted but lighter somehow, Caleb spoke carefully. "You know what I think? I think Daniel would be glad his things are being used, that his mother found a way to keep living, keep loving, keep giving even after losing him. You can't know that." "No, but I know what I'd want for Samuel if something happened to him. I'd want whoever survived him to find joy again, to use his things to help other children, to remember him with love instead of just pain." Caleb paused. "Mary would want the same for us. She'd want Samuel raised by two people who love him, not by a father drowning in grief." "When did you become so wise?" "I'm not wise. I'm just tired of grief being the only thing that defines us." He pulled Elena closer, and this time she came willingly, fitting against his side as if she belonged there. "We've both lost people we loved. Nothing will change that, but we don't have to let loss be the end of our story." They sat together on the floor, Samuel between them, creating a small circle of warmth and possibility. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Inside, a family was forming, not the families any of them had planned, but a family nonetheless. Over the following weeks, the transformation continued. Elena laughed more freely. Caleb found himself thinking about the future with anticipation rather than dread. And Samuel grew, oblivious to the adult dramas swirling around him, focused entirely on the business of being loved and fed and kept warm. One morning in late May, Caleb woke to find Elena in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with unusual care. She'd made eggs, biscuits, and even honey to go with the coffee. When he raised an eyebrow in question, she blushed slightly. "I've been thinking," she said, not meeting his eyes. "About what you said. About this being real." Caleb's heart rate increased. And I think you're right. We can keep pretending this is temporary, or we can acknowledge what's actually happening." Elena set down the pan she'd been holding and turned to face him fully. "I love Samuel. I can't help it, and I—" She stopped, gathering courage. "I care about you too. More than I thought I would. More than might be wise given how recently we've both lost people. Elena, let me finish." She held up a hand. "I'm not saying I'm ready for everything that being your actual wife might mean, but I'm willing to try. To really try, not just go through the motions." She paused. "If you still want that." Caleb crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms. "I want that more than anything." They stood holding each other, And for the first time, there was no grief between them. No ghosts, no guilt, just two living people choosing each other with full awareness of what that choice meant. So what now? Elena asked against his shoulder. Now we build a life. Together. All three of us. The town will still talk. Let them talk. We know the truth. Elena pulled back enough to look at his face. And what is the truth? The truth is that we found each other in the worst moment of both our lives. And instead of drowning separately, we learned to swim together. That's not a scandal. That's survival. That's love. Love, Elena repeated, testing the word. Is that what this is? What else would you call it? Convenient? Practical? Born of necessity? Can it be all those things and still be love? Caleb touched her face gently. We didn't meet the way most couples do, but we're building something real anyway. I don't need it to look like a storybook romance. I just need it to be ours. Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. You're ridiculous. You know that? So I've been told. And you're too good for someone like me. That's where you're wrong. We're exactly right for each other. Two broken people who figured out how to be whole together. They kissed then, tentative at first, then with growing certainty. It wasn't the passionate kiss of new lovers or the comfortable kiss of long-married partners. It was something in between, acknowledgement and promise and hope all tangled together. When they finally broke apart, Samuel was crying from his basket, demanding attention as always. Elena laughed and went to pick him up, and Caleb watched them together, his wife and his son, feeling something close to contentment settle in his chest. The summer brought changes beyond their relationship. The ranch began producing again under Caleb's renewed attention. The vegetable garden flourished under Elena's care. Samuel reached 6 months old and began the transition to solid foods, marking the beginning of the end of Elena's role as wet nurse. Caleb watched Elena's face carefully during this transition, knowing it represented both freedom and loss. She'd saved Samuel by feeding him, but that feeding had also bound them together in the most intimate way possible. Ending it meant acknowledging that Samuel no longer needed her in that fundamental capacity. "How are you feeling?" he asked one evening as she prepared a bowl of mashed vegetables for Samuel. Strange, relieved and sad at the same time. Elena stirred the bowl absently. For months, my body has been doing this one essential thing, and now it's not needed anymore. You're still needed, just differently. I know. But it's still an ending. She looked at him. Does that make sense? Perfect sense. Every milestone is an ending of something even as it's a beginning of something else. They fed Samuel together, both of them getting more food on themselves than in the baby's mouth, laughing at his expressions when he tasted new flavors. This was their life now, the small domestic moments that added up to something larger than either of them had thought possible months ago. In July, Caleb made a decision. He sold the ranch. Elena was shocked when he told her. But that land was yours and Mary's dream. You can't just give it up. I'm not giving it up. I'm choosing something different. Caleb spread the sale papers on the table. The ranch is 6 miles from town. If we live there, Samuel grows up isolated, and you're cut off from what little community you've built here. If we stay in town, I'm constantly riding back and forth, never fully present either place. So you're selling? I'm selling the land but keeping the cattle. There's a property on the edge of town, 5 acres with a good house and a barn. Close enough that you can walk to the market, far enough that we have space. We can run a smaller operation, keep chickens and a few head of cattle, grow vegetables. It won't be the ranch Mary and I dreamed of, but it will be ours. All 3 of ours. Elena stared at the papers, her expression unreadable. You do that? Give up your dream for me and Samuel? It's not giving up, it's choosing better. Mary and I wanted the ranch because we wanted to build something together. Well, I'm still building something together, just with you instead. He took her hand. Unless you'd prefer the ranch? We can make that work too. No, I want to stay near town. I want Samuel to have friends, to go to school with other children. She stopped, emotion thick in her voice. I want what you're offering, a home, a real one. They moved in August, transporting their combined belongings to the new property. It had a spacious main house with 3 bedrooms, a well-built barn, and a garden plot that was already producing. The previous owners, an elderly couple moving to live with their daughter in Denver, had maintained it beautifully. Elena walked through the empty rooms with wonder, touching walls and windowsills as if she couldn't quite believe this was real. "We can paint," Caleb said, watching her. "Fix it up however you want. It's yours to shape." "Ours," she corrected. "It's ours." They spent the next weeks making the house a home. Caleb repaired loose boards and painted walls. Elena sewed curtains and made the bedrooms comfortable. They set up a nursery for Samuel, filling it with the crib Caleb had built, the quilts Mary had sewn, and the toys that had belonged to Daniel. The past and present mingling, creating something new. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset with Samuel playing at their feet, Elena spoke quietly. "I'm happy. I didn't think I'd ever be able to say that again, but I am." Caleb pulled her close. "So am I. It feels disloyal somehow. To be happy when Mary and Daniel aren't here to share it. Or maybe it's the greatest tribute we can give them, living fully, loving completely, building something good from the wreckage they left behind." Caleb kissed the top of her head. "I think they'd both want that for us." Elena was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "I think so too." September brought Samuel's first birthday. Elena organized a small celebration, just Margaret Flynn and Sheriff Bennett and a few other people who'd shown kindness during the difficult months. They gathered in the new house, eating cake and watching Samuel destroy his first taste of frosting with enthusiastic glee. "Look at him," Margaret said, smiling. "Hard to believe this is the same baby who was dying in your arms 9 months ago." Caleb looked at his son, healthy, happy, covered in cake, and completely unaware of how close he'd come to not surviving his first days of life. "It is hard to believe." "You both did well," Sheriff Bennett observed, nodding toward Elena. "Built something good from a bad situation." "We got lucky," Elena said. "Luck had nothing to do with it. You made choices. Hard ones. And you stuck with them even when the whole town was against you." Bennett raised his glass. "That takes courage." After the guests left, Caleb and Elena sat together watching Samuel sleep in his crib, exhausted from his birthday excitement. "A year ago, I was holding Mary's hand while she died," Caleb said quietly. "I thought my life was over, that I'd never feel anything but grief again. And now? Now I have you, and Samuel, and this house, this life. It's not what I planned, but it's good. Maybe better than what I planned." Elena leaned against him. "Is it wrong that I barely think about my former husband anymore? That when I remember Daniel, it doesn't destroy me like it used to?" "I don't think it's wrong. I think it means you're healing. I used to think healing meant forgetting, but it's not that, is it? No, it's making room for new memories alongside the old ones. It's choosing to keep living even though people we love didn't get that choice." They sat in the quiet nursery, two people who'd found each other in the darkest moment of both their lives and somehow built a family from that darkness. It wasn't the family either of them had planned, but it was real, and it was theirs, and it was enough. Winter came again, bringing with it the anniversary of that terrible night when Caleb had collapsed on the church steps with his dying son. He woke early on that anniversary morning, careful not to disturb Elena sleeping beside him. She'd finally, tentatively, moved into his bedroom 2 months prior and went to stand by Samuel's crib. The baby slept soundly, his chest rising and falling in healthy rhythm. 15 months old now, walking, babbling, full of personality and life. A miracle, Caleb thought. Not the religious kind, but the human kind. The miracle of two people refusing to give up, refusing to let death win. He felt Elena's presence before she spoke, her hand sliding into his. "Remembering?" she asked quietly. "How could I not? A year ago tonight, I thought I'd lost everything. Instead, you found me. Instead, we found each other." Caleb turned to face her. "Do you ever regret it, opening your door that night?" Elena was quiet for a moment, considering. "Sometimes I regret how hard it's been. The town's judgment, the pain of loving Samuel knowing I'd have to let him go. The fear of opening my heart again after it had been so thoroughly broken." She paused. "But I don't regret opening the door. I don't regret saving him, and I don't regret falling in love with both of you." It was the first time she'd said it so directly. "I love you." Not qualified, not hedged, just plain truth. I love you too, Caleb said. Not the same way I loved Mary, but just as real, just as deep. I know, and that's enough. It's more than enough. They stood together watching their son sleep, and Caleb felt the last pieces of his grief settling into something he could carry without being crushed by it. Mary would always be part of him, and Elena would always carry Daniel in her heart. But they'd made room for new love, new life, new possibilities. Samuel stirred and opened his eyes, seeing his parents standing over him. His face split into a wide smile, and he reached up, wanting to be held. Elena picked him up, and he immediately reached for Caleb, wanting both of them. They stood there, the three of them, as the sun began to rise over Grafton. "Mama," Samuel said, one of his few words patting Elena's face. "That's right, sweet boy. Mama's here." "Papa," he added, patting Caleb's shoulder. "Papa's here too. We're both here. Always." It was a promise Caleb knew they couldn't absolutely guarantee. Life was too uncertain, death too unpredictable. But it was a promise they could choose to keep every day they were given. And that choosing, that daily commitment to each other and to Samuel, was what made them a family. The town had long since stopped talking about the scandal of Caleb Turner and Elena Moore. They were just another family now, notable only for having survived tragedy and come out stronger. Dutch Matthews had moved to another town, unable to bear watching their happiness. The Reverend had eventually made his peace with them, even visiting occasionally to check on Samuel's welfare. Spring came again, bringing new life to the garden Elena tended. Summer followed, with Samuel taking his first steps in the yard while both parents watched with pride and terror. Fall arrived, painting the world in shades of gold and red. And winter returned, but this time it found them prepared. Wood stacked high, pantry full, a family united against whatever cold might come. On a particularly bitter January evening, as snow fell heavy outside their warm house, Elena and Caleb sat together by the fire. Samuel was asleep upstairs, and they had rare quiet time together. "Do you think we should have another?" Elena asked suddenly. Caleb looked at her in surprise. "Another child?" "It's probably too soon. I'm probably being foolish. But Samuel needs siblings, and I think I'm ready to try again, to have a baby of my own with you." Caleb's throat tightened with emotion. This was Elena choosing not just to accept the family they'd built, but to expand it, choosing to risk pregnancy and childbirth again despite losing Daniel, choosing to trust that this time might be different. "Are you sure? After everything you've been through, I'm terrified," she admitted, "but I'm also hopeful, and I want Samuel to have brothers or sisters. I want to give you a child that's truly ours, not born of tragedy but of love." "Samuel is ours. Biology doesn't change that." "I know, but I want this anyway." She took his hand and placed it on her stomach. "What do you think?" "I think you're the bravest person I've ever met. And if you're ready, then I'm ready too." They sat together dreaming of a future that included more children, more laughter, more life. The ghosts of Mary and Daniel were still there, would always be there, but they weren't haunting anymore. They were witnesses to the resilience of the human heart, to its capacity to love again after devastating loss. 2 years after that terrible winter night, Caleb stood in the kitchen of their home, watching Elena teach Samuel how to help with breakfast. She was visibly pregnant now, 6 months along with the daughter they'd learn about in 3 more months. Samuel was careful with the eggs, his small tongue sticking out in concentration as he helped his mother. This was their life. Ordinary and extraordinary all at once. Built from loss and grief and the desperate need to survive, it had transformed into something neither of them could have predicted. Love. Not the easy love of fairy tales, but the complicated love of real people who'd seen the worst life could offer and chosen to keep living anyway. Who'd found each other in darkness and built toward light. Who'd taken a dying baby and made him the center of a family that shouldn't have worked, but somehow did. "Papa, look," Samuel called, holding up an egg triumphantly. "I see, buddy. Good job." Elena caught his eye over Samuel's head and smiled. The full, genuine smile she'd learned to give again after months of grief. Caleb smiled back, feeling gratitude wash over him for this moment, this morning, this life they'd created from ashes. The town of Grafton had moved on to other scandals, other stories, but in this house on the edge of town, 3 people, soon to be 4, continued writing their own story. A story that began with death and desperation but transformed into something beautiful. A story of two broken people who learned that sometimes the best families are the ones you build from wreckage, the ones you choose rather than the ones you're born into. And as snow began to fall again outside, covering the world in fresh white, Caleb thought about beginnings and endings, about how Mary's death had led to Elena's salvation, how Daniel's loss had made room for Samuel's life, about how the worst night of his existence had become the first night of his second chance. Love, he'd learned, wasn't about replacing what you'd lost. It was about making room for what you'd found. And he'd found more than he ever thought possible in this complicated woman and this thriving child and the daughter yet to be born. "Come eat," Elena called, pulling him from his thoughts. Before Samuel decides eggs belong on the floor instead of the plate. Caleb joined his family at the table, Samuel between them, chattering about his eggs and the snow and everything his toddler mind found fascinating. This was home. This was family. This was love. Messy and imperfect and absolutely real. And it was enough. More than enough. It was everything.